Hey friends, welcome to the Horror Sleep. Almost 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these true park ranger horror stories, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Oh, and where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. My name is Evan Mallister, and for the past 11 years, I have been working as a forest ranger for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. My work is primarily in the High Peaks wilderness area of Adirondack Park. If you've never had the chance to see the Adirondacks, imagine this. Approximately 6 million acres of protected wilderness in northeastern New York, over 2,000 miles of hiking trails, 46 mountain peaks over 4,000 feet high, and countless lakes, some without even official names. This is a place where you can hike for 4 days without seeing another soul, where the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. I grew up downstate in Westchester County, which is about as far removed from wilderness living as you can get, while still technically being in New York. My childhood was strip malls and soccer practice, and the constant hum of traffic on the Hutchinson River Parkway. But every summer, my parents would pack up our old Subaru and drive us north to a rental cabin near Lake George. And those 2 weeks in July were the only times I felt like I could actually breathe. There was something about the Adirondacks that called to me even as a kid, some quality I couldn't quite name. The way the morning mist would rise off the lake like ghosts ascending to heaven. The smell of balsam fir and wet earth after a thunderstorm. The absolute certainty that you were standing in a place that existed long before humans walked the earth and would continue to exist long after we were gone. When I was 19 and completely lost about what to do with my life, I applied for a seasonal position with the DEC on a whim. I figured I'd spend one summer living in the woods, get it out of my system, then go back to civilization and find a real job. That was 11 years ago, and I've never left. Started as a seasonal trail maintenance worker, then worked my way up through various positions until I finally earned my ranger commission. The pay isn't great, and the hours are brutal, but I can't imagine doing anything else. Most people don't understand that kind of commitment to a place. But then again, most people have never experienced the Adirondacks the way I have. The incident I'm about to tell you about happened in early September of last year. September is my favorite time to work in the High Peaks because the summer crowds have mostly thinned out, but the weather is still decent, at least during the day. The nights get cold though, dropping down into the 30s sometimes, and that's when the Adirondacks start to show their true nature. The place transforms after dark. All those beautiful vistas and picturesque trails take on a different character when the sun goes down. The forest becomes a maze of shadows and strange sounds, and even after 11 years, I still get that primitive prickle at the back of my neck when I'm out there alone at night. I was partnered up that week with Holly Keene, a newer ranger who'd transferred in from the Catskills region about 6 months prior. Holly was good at her job, maybe a little too by the book for my taste, but reliable and level-headed in situations that would make most people panic. She was in her late 20s, originally from somewhere in Pennsylvania, and had that specific brand of toughness that comes from growing up in rural America. She didn't talk much about her personal life, which was fine by me. Out here, your past doesn't matter as much as your ability to function when things go wrong. On the morning of September 8th, Holly and I were assigned to do a routine patrol of the trails around Lake Colden. If you know the High Peaks region at all, you're probably familiar with Lake Colden. It sits in a glacial valley between Mount Colden and Algonquin Peak, accessible only by foot via a network of hiking trails. The lake itself is pristine, about a mile long and maybe a quarter-mile wide, surrounded by dense forest and ringed by mountains on all sides. There's a lean-to shelter on the eastern shore where backpackers can camp overnight, but otherwise the area is completely undeveloped. No roads, no buildings, nothing but wilderness. We started our patrol just after dawn, hiking in from the Adirondack Lodge parking area. It was one of those perfect September mornings where the air is crisp and clean, and everything seems sharper somehow, like the whole world has been brought into high definition. The trail was in good condition, no major blowdowns or erosion to worry about, and we made good time. We stopped briefly at Marcy Dam to check in with a group of backpackers who were heading up to Avalanche Lake, made sure they had proper bear canisters and knew what they were doing, then continued on toward Lake Colden. The thing about being a ranger is that probably 90% of the job is just routine maintenance and visitor interaction. You check trails, you enforce regulations, you help lost hikers find their way. You educate people about leave-no-trace principles. It's repetitive work and honestly kind of boring most of the time. But that other 10%, the parts that nobody tells you about during training, that's where things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean the kind of experiences that make you question what you think you know about the world. We reached Lake Colden around 9 in the morning. The lean-to was empty, which wasn't surprising for a weekday in September. We did a quick inspection of the shelter to make sure nobody had left any trash or food waste that might attract bears. Then Holly suggested we do a perimeter check of the lake before heading back. Standard procedure, nothing unusual about it. We split up to cover more ground. Holly took the western shore, and I took the eastern shore, planning to meet up at the northern end of the lake in about 45 minutes. The eastern shoreline of Lake Colden is rocky and uneven, with thick stands of black spruce and balsam fir crowding right down to the water's edge. There's no real trail along this section, just a rough path worn by the occasional fisherman or photographer looking for a good spot. I picked my way carefully over exposed roots and moss-covered stones, keeping one eye on the lake and one eye on the forest. Even though it was a beautiful morning, there was something about the atmosphere around the lake that felt off to me. Nothing I could put my finger on exactly, just a vague sense of unease that made the hair on my arms stand up. About 20 minutes into my walk, I noticed something out on the lake. At first I thought it was just a piece of driftwood, or maybe a loon diving for fish, but as I got closer I realized it was something else entirely. There was an object floating in the water, maybe 30 feet from shore, perfectly vertical like it was standing upright on the surface. I stopped walking and pulled out my binoculars to get a better look. It was a camping lantern. One of those old-fashioned kerosene lanterns with a metal frame and glass panels, the kind my grandfather used to have hanging in his garage. But here's what made me stop and stare. The lantern wasn't lying on its side or floating horizontally like you'd expect if it had fallen off someone's backpack or been knocked into the water. It was standing perfectly upright, balanced on the surface of the lake as if it were sitting on a table. The water around it was completely still, no ripples or disturbance of any kind. It was just there, vertical and motionless, in the middle of Lake Colden. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that there's usually a rational explanation for weird things. A log beneath the surface holding the lantern up, or some trick of refraction making it appear to be floating when it was actually resting on a submerged rock. But the water at that point in the lake was at least 15 feet deep. I knew that for a fact because I'd been out here with the fisheries biologists when they did depth surveys. And the surface was so calm that I should have been able to see clearly down to the bottom if there was anything supporting the lantern from below. I stood there for a good 5 minutes trying to make sense of what I was seeing, running through every possible explanation in my head and rejecting each one as soon as I thought of it. Finally, I decided I needed to get a closer look. I radioed Holly to let her know I'd found something unusual and was going to investigate. Then I started looking for a way to get out to where the lantern was floating. There was a small patch of gravelly beach about 10 yards to my left, and I could see what looked like an old rowboat pulled up into the brush. The boat was in rough shape, probably left behind by some fisherman years ago and forgotten, but it looked seaworthy enough for a short trip. I dragged it down to the water's edge, found a weathered paddle wedged under the seats, and pushed off from shore. The moment my boat hit the water, the feeling of unease I'd been experiencing intensified. It was like the air pressure had suddenly changed, or like I'd just walked into a room where two people had been having an argument right before I arrived. The atmosphere around me felt thick and heavy, almost oppressive. Every sound seemed muted and distant. Even the gentle splash of my paddle dipping into the water sounded wrong somehow, like it was coming from very far away. I rowed slowly toward the lantern, watching it the entire time. It didn't move, it didn't bob or drift with the current. It just stood there on the surface of the lake, waiting. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The metal frame was old and corroded, streaked with rust and mineral deposits. The glass panels were cloudy with age, and I could see what looked like a wick inside, the kind you'd light with a match to produce a flame. When I was about 10 feet away, I stopped rowing and just sat there in the boat, staring at the thing. Part of me wanted to reach out and grab it, to solve this mystery and find some logical explanation for what I was seeing. But another part of me, the part that's kept me alive and uninjured for 11 years in some of the most unforgiving wilderness in the Northeast, was screaming at me to turn the boat around and get the hell away from this thing as fast as possible. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts or curses or any of that supernatural nonsense, but I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that there are things out here that don't follow the rules we're taught in school, things that can't be easily explained or categorized. The forest has its own logic, its own set of laws, and sometimes you encounter something that operates according to principles you don't understand. Smart rangers learn to recognize those moments and respond appropriately. But I was curious, and curiosity is a powerful thing. I reached out with the paddle and gently touched the base of the lantern, ready to pull back immediately if anything weird happened. The lantern wobbled slightly but didn't fall over or sink beneath the surface. I tapped it a little harder, and this time it tipped onto its side and began floating normally like any object would in water. Whatever had been holding it upright was gone. I used the paddle to pull the lantern closer to the boat until I could reach down and grab it. The metal was ice cold, so cold that it actually hurt to touch, but I managed to lift it out of the water and set it carefully in the bottom of the boat. Up close, I could see that the glass panels weren't just cloudy with age. They were covered in a thin layer of frost, despite the fact that it was at least 60 degrees outside and the sun was shining directly on the lake. And here's the part that really got to me. The wick inside the lantern wasn't just old and dry. It was charred. Recently charred. I could smell the faint acrid scent of burnt kerosene, and when I touched the metal around the wick chamber, it was warm. Not hot exactly, but noticeably warmer than the rest of the lantern, like someone had extinguished the flame only minutes before I found it. I sat in that boat for a long time, holding the freezing cold lantern with its mysteriously warm interior, trying to process what I was dealing with here. Someone had been using this lantern recently, that much was obvious. But who, and where were they now? And more importantly, how had the lantern ended up standing vertically in the middle of Lake Colden? I heard Holly calling to me from the shore. She'd completed her circuit of the lake and was wondering what was taking me so long. I waved to her, then carefully rowed back to the beach with the lantern cradled in my lap. The whole time, that feeling of wrongness persisted, like I was being watched by something I couldn't see. When I pulled the boat back onto the gravel, Holly was waiting for me with her arms crossed and an expression of mild annoyance on her face. She doesn't like it when I go off script during our patrols, says it makes scheduling difficult and throws off the whole day's routine. But when she saw what I was carrying, her expression changed to something I'd never seen on her face before. Not quite fear, but definitely concern mixed with confusion. "Where did you get that?" she asked, staring at the lantern. It was floating in the lake, I said. About 30 feet from shore, standing straight up like someone had placed it on a table. Holly looked at me like I'd just told her I'd seen Bigfoot doing backflips. That's not possible. I know, I said, but that's what happened. She reached out to touch the lantern, then jerked her hand back when she felt how cold it was. Jesus, Evan, that thing is freezing. Touch the wick chamber, I told her. The inside is warm. She did, and I watched her face go through the same series of expressions mine probably had. Confusion, denial, and finally a kind of reluctant acceptance that something very strange was going on here. There was someone out here last night, Holly said slowly, thinking it through out loud. Someone with a camping lantern. They must have dropped it in the lake somehow, and we found it this morning. That's what I thought too, I agreed. But check the overnight logs. Nobody was supposed to be camping at Lake Colden last night. The lean-to was empty when we checked it, no signs of recent use, and besides, how does a lantern end up standing vertically in water? Holly didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. We stood there on the shore of Lake Colden, passing the impossible lantern back and forth between us, while all around us the forest watched and waited in absolute silence. After about 10 minutes of examining the lantern and coming up with nothing but more questions, Holly made the decision that we needed to report this back to headquarters. She pulled out her radio and tried to raise someone, but all she got was static. The mountains around Lake Colden create a natural bowl that plays hell with radio signals, and we were basically cut off from communication unless we hiked back up to higher ground. We should pack this thing up and bring it back with us, Holly said, already pulling out a large evidence bag from her pack. Rangers carry all kinds of supplies in the field, and Holly was particularly well prepared, almost obsessively so. She sealed the lantern in the bag, being careful not to touch the metal directly, then stowed it in her pack. Before we left, I suggested we do one more sweep of the area, just to make sure we weren't missing anything obvious. Holly agreed, and we spent the next half hour combing the shoreline and checking the surrounding forest for any signs of recent human activity. We found nothing. No footprints in the soft mud near the water's edge, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation, no trash or equipment left behind. It was as if the lantern had simply materialized out of thin air in the middle of the lake. The hike back to the lodge took us about 2 hours, and the whole time I couldn't stop thinking about that lantern. There had to be a rational explanation, I kept telling myself. Maybe a kayaker had been out on the lake early that morning and lost the lantern overboard. Maybe it had been caught in some freak current or wind pattern that held it upright temporarily. Maybe the warmth of the wick chamber was just residual heat from the sun that I'd misinterpreted as something more sinister. But none of those explanations felt right. The lake had been completely calm when I found the lantern, no wind at all. And the sun hadn't been up long enough to warm the metal to that degree. Plus, there was the frost, which made no sense at all given the ambient temperature. When we got back to the ranger station, Holly immediately went to file a report with our supervisor, Chuck Morrison. Chuck had been with the DEC for almost 30 years and had seen pretty much everything the Adirondacks could throw at him. If anyone could provide a reasonable explanation for what we'd found, it would be Chuck. I tagged along to Chuck's office, still carrying my pack and sweating through my uniform shirt despite the cool air. Chuck was sitting at his desk working through a stack of paperwork when we walked in, and he looked up with the weary expression of a man who really didn't want to deal with anything complicated today. "What have you got for me?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Holly set her pack on his desk and carefully pulled out the evidence bag containing the lantern. "We found this at Lake Colden this morning. Evan says it was floating in the water, standing vertically." Chuck leaned forward and peered at the lantern through the plastic bag. For a long moment he didn't say anything, just stared at it with an unreadable expression on his face. Then he sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes with both hands. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked quietly. "Eastern shore, about a quarter-mile south of the lean-to," I said. 30 feet from shore, in about 15 feet of water. "And you're sure it was standing upright?" "Positive. I watched it for 5 minutes before I went out to get it. It didn't move at all, just stood there on the surface like it was defying gravity." Chuck was quiet again, and I could see him thinking something through, weighing whether or not to tell us something. Finally, he opened one of his desk drawers and pulled out a file folder that looked old and worn, like it had been handled many times over the years. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened at Lake Colden," Chuck said, opening the file and spreading several documents across his desk. "In fact, it's been happening on and off for at least 40 years, maybe longer." He showed us incident reports dating back to 1983, all of them describing similar discoveries at Lake Colden. A cooking pot found floating vertically in the water. A backpack standing upright on the surface of the lake. A pair of hiking boots positioned side by side in the middle of the water, as if someone invisible was wearing them. All of the objects were found in roughly the same location. All of them were described as being impossibly cold despite the weather, and in every case the objects showed signs of recent use, even though no one was supposed to be in the area. "What the hell is this?" Holly asked, reading through one of the reports. "Why haven't I heard about this before?" "Because officially, there's nothing to hear about," Chuck said. "Every single one of these incidents has been investigated, and every single one has been written off as coincidence or misidentification or faulty memory. The DEC doesn't want to deal with the PR nightmare of acknowledging that something genuinely strange is happening in one of our most popular wilderness areas." "But you believe it," I said. It wasn't a question. Chuck nodded slowly. "I was there for one of these incidents back in '97. I saw a tent standing upright in the middle of the lake, fully erected like someone was camping on the surface of the water. Watched it for 20 minutes before it finally tipped over and sank. I wrote up a full report, included witness statements from 2 other rangers who saw the same thing I did. And you know what happened? Nothing. The report was filed away, and I was told to stop wasting everyone's time with ghost stories." He closed the file folder and locked it back in his drawer. "Look, I don't know what's going on at Lake Colden, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. But I've been in these mountains long enough to accept that there are some things we're not going to understand. My advice to both of you is to write up your reports, turn in the lantern for analysis, and then forget about it. Don't go digging into this any deeper than you already have." But I couldn't forget about it. Over the next few days, while the lantern was being examined by DEC scientists who would ultimately conclude that there was nothing unusual about it at all, I started doing my own research into Lake Colden. I spent hours in the Saranac Lake Public Library going through old newspapers and historical records, and what I found was disturbing. Lake Colden has a history that most tourists never hear about. In the early 1800s, before the area was designated as wilderness, there was a small logging camp on the eastern shore where I'd found the lantern. According to local records, the camp was abandoned suddenly in 1832, after all 12 of the loggers disappeared without a trace. Search parties found the camp intact, with food still sitting out on the tables and equipment left in the middle of various tasks, as if everyone had simply vanished mid-action. There were other incidents, too, scattered throughout the years. A group of 4 hikers who went missing in 1956 and were never found, despite extensive searches. A forest ranger who drowned in the lake in 1973 under circumstances that were never adequately explained. Multiple reports of strange lights seen on the lake at night, often described as looking like lantern light or campfire flames. But when rangers investigated, they found no one there. The more I read, the more I became convinced that Lake Colden was the site of something ongoing, something that had been happening for generations. The floating objects weren't random coincidences. They were evidence of some kind of presence, some force or entity that existed in that place and occasionally made itself known in ways that couldn't be easily dismissed. I knew I should let it go, just like Chuck had advised. I had a good job, a stable life, and no compelling reason to risk either by pursuing what was essentially a ghost story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something important, something that demanded investigation regardless of the potential consequences. 2 weeks after finding the lantern, I made a decision that I knew was probably stupid, but felt necessary anyway. I requested a solo overnight patrol of the Lake Colden area, citing trail maintenance that needed to be completed. It wasn't entirely a lie. There was some work that needed doing on the eastern trail, but my real reason for going was to spend a night at the lake and see if anything unusual happened after dark. Chuck approved my request without comment, though I caught a look in his eye that suggested he knew exactly what I was planning and didn't approve. Holly tried to talk me out of it, said I was being reckless and that nothing good would come from sleeping alone in a place with Lake Colden's history. But I was determined, and once I make up my mind about something, it's hard to sway me. I hiked into Lake Colden on a Thursday afternoon in late September, carrying a heavy pack loaded with camping gear, food for 2 days, and a very powerful flashlight that I'd purchased specifically for this trip. The weather was perfect, clear skies and comfortable temperatures, though the forecast called for clouds rolling in overnight. I set up my tent at the lean-to on the eastern shore, in the exact spot where the old logging camp would have stood nearly 200 years ago. As the sun began to set behind Algonquin Peak, I sat on a rock near the water's edge and watched the light fade from the sky. The lake was absolutely still, its surface like dark glass reflecting the purpling sky and the first faint stars. There were no other campers in the area, no voices or laughter echoing across the water. It was just me and the forest and the lake, exactly as I'd wanted. Night fell quickly in the mountains, and within an hour of sunset I was surrounded by complete darkness. I'd deliberately not built a fire, wanting to preserve my night vision and avoid creating any light that might interfere with whatever I might see. I sat in the darkness with my flashlight off, listening to the forest sounds around me and watching the lake for any sign of movement. Hours passed. The temperature dropped steadily and I pulled on an extra fleece layer to ward off the chill. The moon rose late, a waxing crescent that provided barely any illumination. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like voices coming from somewhere across the lake, faint and distant, but distinctly human. I strained to make out words but couldn't. The voices lasted for maybe 5 minutes and then stopped abruptly. At 2:47 a.m., I checked my watch because I wanted to be precise about the time. I saw a light appear on the lake. It was small at first, just a faint glow near the center of the water, but it quickly grew brighter. Within seconds, I could clearly make out what it was. A lantern, identical to the one I'd found 2 weeks ago, standing vertically on the surface of Lake Colden and burning with a steady yellow flame. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet, afraid that my own light might somehow disrupt what I was seeing. The lantern just hung there in space, its reflection shimmering on the dark water below it. The flame inside the glass panels flickered and danced, and I could swear I saw shadows moving around it, like there were people gathered near the light even though I couldn't see any figures. Then, as I watched, more lights began to appear. First one, then another, then several more, until there were at least a dozen lanterns floating on the surface of Lake Colden in a rough circle. They all burned with the same steady yellow flame, and around them the water remained perfectly calm despite a breeze that had picked up and was rustling the leaves in the trees behind me. I don't know how long I sat there watching those lights. Time seemed to slow down or stop entirely, and I lost all sense of how many minutes or hours were passing. At some point, I became aware that I could hear voices again, clearer this time, speaking in what sounded like an old dialect of English that I could barely understand. I caught fragments of sentences. The work must continue. Before the ice comes. Not much time left. And then, one by one, the lanterns began to go out. Not all at once, but in sequence, like someone was walking around the circle, extinguishing them one after another. When the last light vanished, the darkness that descended felt absolute and suffocating, like the world had been erased and I was floating in a void. I finally turned on my flashlight, needing to reassure myself that reality still existed, and swept the beam across the lake. The water was empty. No lights, no lanterns, nothing but the normal reflection of my flashlight on the rippling surface. I checked my watch again. 4:33 a.m. Nearly 2 hours had passed while I'd been watching the lights, though it had felt like only minutes. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of that night. I sat huddled in my tent with my flashlight on and my radio close at hand, jumping at every sound from the forest around me. When dawn finally came and the sky began to lighten, I felt a profound sense of relief mixed with disappointment. I'd seen something extraordinary, something that confirmed my suspicions about Lake Colden, but I had no way to prove it. No photographs, no physical evidence, nothing but my own testimony, which I knew would be dismissed as easily as all the other reports in Chuck's file. I packed up my gear quickly and was on the trail back to the lodge by 6 a.m., eager to put some distance between myself and the lake. The hike out felt longer than usual, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being followed even though I never saw or heard anyone behind me. When I got back to the ranger station, Holly was already there starting her shift. She took one look at me and immediately knew something had happened. "You saw something," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, then told her everything. The lights on the lake, the voices, the hours that felt like minutes. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know, I can't put any of this in an official report," she finally said. "I know. And you know that even if you tried to tell people what you saw, nobody would believe you. I know that too." Holly sat down at her desk and logged into her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. After a few minutes, she turned the monitor so I could see what she was looking at. It was a digital archive of old DEC reports, dating back to the 1960s. "I've been doing some research of my own," she said quietly. "Ever since we found that lantern, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And look what I found." She pulled up a report from 1968 written by a ranger named Thomas Whitmore. In it, Whitmore described spending a night at Lake Colden and witnessing multiple lanterns floating on the water in a circular pattern. His report had been stamped unreliable and filed away without further investigation. Holly showed me similar reports from 1974, 1981, 1989, 1995, and 2003. All of them described the same phenomenon: multiple lanterns appearing on Lake Colden after dark, burning for hours, then vanishing without a trace. "There's a pattern," Holly said, pointing at the dates. The sightings happen roughly every 7 to 8 years, always in September or early October. And look at this. Every single sighting occurred during a waxing crescent moon, just like last night. She was right. The pattern was undeniable once you knew to look for it. Whatever was happening at Lake Colden wasn't random. It was cyclical, following some kind of schedule that had nothing to do with human activity. "So, what do you think it is?" I asked. Holly shook her head. "I have no idea, but I've been reading about that old logging camp, the one that was abandoned in 1832. The records say all 12 loggers vanished, but there's no information about what happened to them. No bodies were ever recovered, no evidence of foul play, nothing. They just disappeared. You think the lanterns are connected to the loggers? I think the lanterns are the loggers, Holly said. Or at least some echo of them, some residual energy that's trapped at the lake and replays itself every few years. Think about it. Logging camps always used kerosene lanterns for light. And 12 loggers, 12 lanterns on the lake. It fits. It did fit, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Why would the loggers be trapped at Lake Colden? What happened to them that was so traumatic it would leave an imprint on that place for nearly 200 years? And why did the phenomenon only manifest every 7 or 8 years? Over the next several weeks, Holly and I continued our research in secret, careful not to let anyone know what we were looking into. We contacted historians, read through old journals and letters, even tracked down descendants of the original logging camp owners. Slowly, a story began to emerge. The winter of 1831 to 1832 was one of the harshest on record in the Adirondacks. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Snow fell in record amounts, cutting off the logging camp from the outside world for most of December and January. According to letters written by one of the camp owners, supplies were running dangerously low by late January, and there was serious concern that the men might not survive until spring. In early February 1832, a supply team attempted to reach the camp by snowshoe, but they found the trail impassable. The camp was completely cut off, buried under 15 feet of snow. When the weather finally broke in late March and another team was able to make it through, they found the camp abandoned. All of the men were gone, but their personal belongings were still there, including their lanterns arranged in a circle on the frozen surface of Lake Colden. The official conclusion was that the loggers had attempted to walk out after their food ran out and had died somewhere in the forest, their bodies buried in snowdrifts or dragged off by animals. But there were details in the historical record that didn't quite fit that narrative. One of the rescuers reported seeing boot prints leading from the camp down to the lake, but the prints stopped at the ice's edge and didn't continue in any direction. Another rescuer mentioned that the arranged lanterns were still burning when they arrived, despite having been left unattended for weeks in below zero temperatures. The more Holly and I learned, the more convinced we became that something terrible had happened to those 12 men. Something that went beyond simple starvation or exposure. They hadn't walked away from the camp. They'd gone down to the lake one February night, arranged their lanterns in a circle, and then, what? Disappeared into thin air? Fallen through the ice and drowned in a perfect circle? Been taken by something that lived in or beneath Lake Colden? We would probably never know the full truth, but at least now we had a framework for understanding what was happening. The lanterns on the lake weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were more like a recording, a traumatic event that had been so powerful it had burned itself into the fabric of that place. And every 7 or 8 years, when the conditions were right, the recording played again. I filed an official report about my overnight stay at Lake Colden, but I left out all mention of the lanterns and lights. I simply noted that the trail maintenance had been completed and that the area appeared to be in good condition. Chuck read the report and didn't comment, though I'm sure he knew I was holding something back. Holly and I made a pact not to discuss what we'd learned with anyone else. It was better, we agreed, to let sleeping dogs lie. Lake Colden would continue to attract hikers and campers, and every 7 or 8 years someone might see something strange out on the water at night. Maybe they'd report it, and maybe they wouldn't, but either way the forest would keep its secrets. That was last September. This coming September will mark another cycle in the pattern, another year when the conditions might align for the phenomenon to occur again. I've requested that week off from work. I'm not planning to go back to Lake Colden. Once was enough for me, and I have no desire to see those lights again. But I know that somewhere out there, on the eastern shore of a pristine mountain lake in the middle of the Adirondack wilderness, 12 lanterns will appear in the darkness and burn until dawn, marking the spot where 12 men vanished nearly 200 years ago and never returned. Holly transferred to a different region last month. She said it was for career advancement, a promotion to a supervisory position in the Catskills, but I think the real reason was that she couldn't handle the working in a place where the rules of reality occasionally stopped applying. I don't blame her. The Adirondacks are beautiful and wild and majestic, but they're also fundamentally unknowable in ways that can be deeply unsettling if you think about it too much. As for me, I'm still here, still working as a ranger, still hiking the trails and checking the lean-tos and helping lost tourists find their way. I love this job, and I love these mountains, but I also have a much healthier respect for them now. There are places in the Adirondack wilderness that belong to something older and stranger than humanity, places where the normal laws of physics and logic don't always apply. Lake Colden is one of those places, and I suspect there are others scattered throughout these 6 million acres of forest. I've learned to recognize the signs now, that feeling of unease that settles over you when you enter certain areas. The way sound seems to travel differently in some valleys. The spots where your compass needle spins uselessly or your radio fills with static for no apparent reason. These are the places where the forest is trying to tell you something, and smart rangers learn to listen. A few weeks ago, I was training a new seasonal ranger, a kid fresh out of college who still thinks wilderness work is all about communing with nature and finding yourself. We were doing trail maintenance near Marcy Dam when he asked me what the most important rule of backcountry ranger work was. I thought about it for a long time before answering. The most important rule, I finally said, is to remember that you're a guest out here. This land was here long before we showed up, and it'll be here long after we're gone. Sometimes you're going to see things you can't explain, encounter situations that don't make sense according to what you learned in school. When that happens, you have two choices. You can try to rationalize it away and convince yourself that there's a logical explanation, or you can accept that there are mysteries in this world that we're not meant to solve. The kid looked at me like I was crazy, which is fair. A year ago, I would have thought the same thing, but now I know better. The wilderness doesn't care about our need for rational explanations. It operates according to its own logic, its own set of rules, and those rules sometimes produce phenomena that seem impossible from our limited human perspective. Do I believe in ghosts? I still don't know. What I saw at Lake Colden could be explained in supernatural terms, or it could be some kind of natural phenomenon that science hasn't adequately studied yet. Maybe those lanterns are the spirits of 12 dead loggers, or maybe they're some kind of electromagnetic anomaly that interacts with human perception in ways we don't understand. Ultimately, the explanation doesn't matter as much as the acknowledgement that something genuinely strange is happening in that place. I've talked to other longtime rangers who've had similar experiences in other parts of the Adirondacks. Lights in the forest that shouldn't be there. Voices calling from empty trails. Footprints that appear and disappear without explanation. Most of them won't talk about it openly because they're afraid of being labeled crazy or unreliable. But in private conversations over beers or around campfires, the stories come out. The wilderness is full of mysteries, and the people who spend the most time in it are the ones most likely to encounter them. There's a quote I like from an old forest ranger whose name I've unfortunately forgotten. He said, "The mountains are patient, the mountains are old, and the mountains remember." I think about that quote a lot now, especially when I'm doing patrol work in the backcountry. These mountains have seen countless human dramas play out over the centuries. Native peoples who lived here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Early settlers and trappers who tried to carve out a living in impossible conditions. loggers and miners who scarred the land in pursuit of profit, and now modern visitors who come seeking recreation and solitude. All of those people left traces behind, some more obvious than others. We can see the physical traces easily enough. Old foundations, abandoned mines, trails cut through the forest. But there are other kinds of traces too, imprints that can't be seen with the naked eye, but that linger nonetheless. Lake Colden is one of those imprints, a place where something happened long ago that was significant enough to leave a permanent mark on the landscape. I don't go to Lake Colden anymore on my regular patrols. I've requested that other rangers handle that area, citing various practical reasons that have nothing to do with floating lanterns or vanishing loggers. Chuck hasn't pushed back on the request, which tells me he understands, even if we never explicitly discuss it. There are plenty of other areas in the High Peaks region that need attention, and one ranger's preferences don't significantly impact the overall workload distribution. But sometimes, on clear September nights when I'm lying in my tent somewhere else in the wilderness, I think about Lake Colden and wonder if the lanterns are burning out there in the darkness. I imagine them arranged in their perfect circle on the water's surface, casting their pale yellow light across the lake while the forest watches in silence. And I wonder about those 12 men, about what they experienced in their final moments, about whether some part of them is still there at the lake, trapped in an endless cycle of reliving that February night in 1832. The rational part of my brain wants to dismiss all of this as fantasy, as the product of an overactive imagination combined with too much time spent alone in the woods. But the part of me that stood on that shore and watched impossible lights burn on the surface of Lake Colden knows better. I saw what I saw, and no amount of rationalization can change that fact. Maybe someday someone will figure out what's really happening at Lake Colden. Maybe some scientist with the right equipment will document the phenomenon and provide a satisfactory explanation that demystifies the whole thing. Or maybe not. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some questions unanswered. Either way, I'm content to let others pursue those investigations. I've seen enough. The Adirondack Park contains roughly 2,000 lakes and ponds, 46 high peaks, countless miles of rivers and streams, and vast stretches of old-growth forest that have never been logged or developed. It's one of the largest protected wilderness areas in the continental United States, and it contains multitudes. Some of those multitudes are documented and well understood. Others remain hidden, known only to the few who happen to stumble across them. Lake Colden is one of those hidden multitudes, a place where the ordinary rules occasionally stop applying and something else takes over. You could visit that lake 100 times and never see anything unusual. You could camp on its shores, swim in its waters, hike the trails around its perimeter, and have a perfectly normal outdoor experience. But if you happen to be there on the right night, in the right conditions, during the right phase of the moon, well, you might see something that changes your understanding of what's possible in this world. I still love my job as a ranger. I still find deep satisfaction in maintaining trails, helping lost hikers, protecting wildlife, and preserving these wild spaces for future generations. But I approach the work differently now, with more humility and awareness of how little we really know about the places we're tasked with protecting. The wilderness isn't just a collection of trees and rocks and animals. It's a living entity with its own memory, its own consciousness perhaps, and its own ways of making itself known to those who pay attention. The broken lantern that Holly and I pulled from Lake Colden last September is currently in storage at the DEC headquarters in Ray Brook. The official analysis concluded it was an ordinary kerosene lantern of mid-20th century manufacture, probably lost by a careless camper and recovered by us during routine patrol work. That's the story that went into the records, and that's the story that will remain unless someone decides to dig deeper into the history of incidents at Lake Colden. I know the truth is more complicated, but truth is often complicated in ways that make people uncomfortable. It's easier to accept simple explanations, to file away anomalies as mistakes or misperceptions, to maintain the fiction that we understand and control our environment. The alternative, acknowledging that there are forces and phenomena beyond our understanding, requires a level of intellectual humility that most people find difficult. But out here in the wilderness, humility isn't optional. The mountains demand it, and they have their ways of teaching it to those who refuse to learn. Sometimes that teaching is gentle, a reminder that you're small and temporary in the face of something vast and eternal. Sometimes it's harsher, a demonstration that your technology and training and expertise mean nothing when nature decides to show you who's really in charge. And sometimes, very rarely, that teaching takes the form of a mystery that can't be solved, a question that can't be answered, a phenomenon that defies explanation. The floating lantern at Lake Colden was that kind of teaching for me. It showed me that after 11 years of working in these mountains, I still don't really understand them. I probably never will. That's okay. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some places keep their secrets, and some stories don't have endings. Lake Colden is one of those stories, and I suspect it will continue long after I'm gone, repeating its cycle every 7 or 8 years, burning its impossible lights in the darkness, reminding anyone who sees them that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we like to admit. If you ever find yourself hiking in the High Peaks wilderness of the Adirondack Park, I encourage you to visit Lake Colden. It really is a beautiful spot, worth the effort it takes to get there. Set up camp, enjoy the scenery, appreciate the solitude. But if you happen to be there on a September night when the moon is a waxing crescent, and you see lights beginning to appear on the surface of the lake, well, watch if you want. Or don't. Either way, remember that you're standing in a place where something happened long ago. Something significant enough to leave a mark that can still be seen by those who know how to look. And if you do watch those lights, if you witness that impossible sight of lanterns burning on water, take a moment to think about those 12 men who vanished in 1832. Think about them gathering on the frozen lake that February night, arranging their lanterns in a circle, and then stepping forward into whatever mystery was waiting for them there. We don't know what happened to them, but we know they left something behind. Maybe that's the real lesson of Lake Colden, that we all leave traces, imprints on the places we inhabit, and some of those imprints last far longer than we could ever imagine. The wilderness remembers. The mountains remember. And at Lake Colden, 12 lanterns burn in the darkness every few years, bearing witness to a mystery that has endured for nearly 2 centuries and shows no signs of fading away. The first thing you need to understand about search and rescue work in the Adirondacks is that most missing persons are found within the first 24 hours, usually embarrassed but unharmed. They took a wrong turn, followed an unmarked game trail, or simply underestimated how quickly darkness falls in the mountains. We find them cold and hungry and relieved to see us, and they go home with a good story to tell at parties. That's how it goes 99 times out of 100. But that 100th time, that's the one that stays with you forever. My name is Ruth Madigan, and I've been a ranger with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation for 16 years. I'm stationed primarily in the High Peaks region of the Adirondack Park, covering an area that includes some of the most challenging and unforgiving terrain in the Northeast. Whiteface Mountain, where this story takes place, is the 5th highest peak in New York State at 4,867 feet. It's also one of the most heavily trafficked mountains in the region, with a paved road running almost to the summit and hiking trails that attract thousands of visitors every year. You'd think that popularity would make it safer, that with so many people around, someone would always be there to help if things went wrong. But the opposite is actually true. Heavy traffic means more opportunities for accidents, more chances for inexperienced hikers to get in over their heads, and more ways for someone to vanish without anyone noticing until it's too late. I grew up in Plattsburgh, about 20 miles northeast of the High Peaks, in a family that had lived in the North Country for 5 generations. My grandfather was a logger, my father worked for the paper mill in Ticonderoga, and I was expected to either leave the area entirely or settle into one of the few career options available to young women in rural northern New York. Instead, I joined the DEC right out of high school, did my 2 years as a seasonal worker, and never looked back. The Adirondacks are in my blood, and I can't imagine living anywhere else. The morning of October 12th started like any other autumn day in the mountains. The leaves were past peak color but still beautiful. The air was crisp without being cold, and the forecast called for clear skies and moderate temperatures. Perfect hiking weather. I was scheduled to do trail maintenance on the Whiteface Mountain Trail, one of the main routes to the summit, along with my partner Logan Fry. Logan was relatively new to the region, having transferred in from the Catskills about 8 months earlier. He was in his early 30s, competent and reliable, but he hadn't yet developed the kind of instinctive feel for the Adirondacks that comes from growing up here. He still occasionally made mistakes that a local wouldn't make, like underestimating how quickly weather could change or not recognizing signs that wildlife had been active in an area recently. Nothing major, nothing that put anyone in danger, but enough that I found myself watching out for him more than I would with a more experienced partner. We met at the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center parking area at the base of Whiteface around 7 a.m. The lot was already half full with early morning hikers eager to get on the trail before the crowds arrived. Logan was waiting by his truck drinking coffee from a thermos, and I could see from his expression that something was bothering him. "Everything okay?" I asked as I got out of my vehicle. "Got a weird call about 20 minutes ago," he said. "Some guy named Marcus Brennan was supposed to meet his hiking group at the summit yesterday afternoon, but he never showed up. They waited until dark, then hiked back down and reported him missing. Did they check the other trails? Maybe he took a different route. They checked, no sign of him. They called his cell phone about 50 times, no answer. The guy's from Brooklyn, first time hiking in the Adirondacks." I felt my stomach tighten. First-time hikers from downstate were the ones most likely to get into serious trouble. They saw pictures of the mountains on Instagram and thought hiking here would be like walking through Central Park, not understanding how remote and dangerous these trails could be, even in good weather. "How long has he been missing?" I asked. "About 17 hours now. His friends said he left the parking lot around noon yesterday, told them he wanted to do the hike solo and would meet them at the summit around 3. When he didn't show up by dark, they figured he'd bailed and gone back to the car, but his car was still here this morning, and his friends haven't heard from him." 17 hours. Long enough for hypothermia to set in if he was injured and immobilized somewhere on the mountain. Long enough for serious dehydration if he'd gotten lost and been walking in circles. Long enough for a lot of bad things to happen. "We need to start a search immediately," I said, already mentally organizing the logistics. "I'll call in additional personnel. You start at the trailhead and see if you can pick up any indication of which way he went." Logan nodded and headed toward the main trail while I got on the radio to dispatch. Within 30 minutes, we had 6 rangers and a dozen trained volunteer search and rescue workers converging on Whiteface Mountain. The coordinator, a veteran ranger named Patricia Hollis, who I'd worked with on dozens of searches over the years, set up a command post in the parking lot and began organizing teams to cover different sections of the mountain. I was assigned to work with Logan, covering the main Whiteface Trail from the base to the tree line. a distance of about 3 miles with an elevation gain of nearly 3,000 feet. If Marcus Brennan had stuck to the main trail, we should be able to find some indication of his passage. A dropped item, a footprint, maybe someone who remembered seeing him. But if he'd wandered off trail, our search area expanded exponentially and our chances of finding him quickly dropped dramatically. Logan and I started up the trail at a quick pace, our eyes scanning the ground for any signs of disturbance. The Whiteface Trail is well maintained and heavily used, which meant the dirt was compacted hard and didn't show footprints easily. We were looking for broken branches, disturbed vegetation, anything that might indicate someone had passed through recently. For the first hour, we found nothing unusual. The trail was busy with other hikers, and we had to stop frequently to ask if anyone had seen a man matching Marcus Brennan's description. Late 20s, about 5'10", medium build, wearing a red jacket and carrying a blue backpack. Nobody had seen him. Most of the hikers we encountered had started their ascent that morning and wouldn't have been on the mountain the previous afternoon anyway. We were about 2 miles up the trail, in a section where the forest was particularly dense and the undergrowth thick, when Logan suddenly stopped and held up his hand. "Ruth, look at this." I moved up beside him and followed his gaze to a spot just off the left side of the trail. There, in a patch of soft mud near a small stream crossing, was a single boot print. It was fresh, probably made within the last 24 hours based on how clearly defined the tread pattern was. The print was headed off the trail into the forest. But here's what made us both stare at it for a long moment without speaking. It was just one print. Not a pair of prints, not a series of prints showing someone walking through the mud. Just one single boot print, about a size 10, pressed deep into the soft earth. "Where's the other one?" Logan asked, voicing the question I was already asking myself. I knelt down next to the print and examined it carefully. The tread pattern was clear enough that I could make out the brand, a common hiking boot sold at most outdoor retailers. The depth of the impression suggested someone carrying a moderate load, maybe 30 or 40 pounds. Everything about the print was normal, except for one glaring impossibility. It was completely alone. "Maybe he stepped on a rock for the other foot," Logan suggested. "Or a log or something solid that wouldn't show a print." I looked around. The area immediately surrounding the single print was all mud, soft and receptive to any pressure. If someone had stepped here with one foot, their other foot had to have landed somewhere, and there was no plausible place within a normal stride length that wouldn't have left a second print. "Let's follow the trajectory," I said, standing up and pulling out my compass. The single print was pointed almost due west, directly into the dense forest. "Stay alert. Something's not right about this." We moved into the forest, carefully noting our position so we could find our way back to the trail. The underbrush was thick with ferns and small shrubs, and we had to push through in some places. We were both looking for more prints, more signs of passage, but for the first 50 feet we found nothing. Then Logan called out from about 10 yards to my left, "Another one!" I made my way over to where he was standing and looked down. There, in another patch of soft ground, was a second single boot print. Same brand, same approximate size, same inexplicable isolation. This print was also pointed west, roughly in line with the first one. "How far apart were they?" I asked. Logan pulled out his rangefinder. 42 feet. 42 feet, an impossible stride length for a human being. Even running at full speed, the average person's stride maxes out at maybe 8 or 9 feet. There was no way someone could have placed 2 footprints 42 feet apart unless they'd been jumping. And if they'd been jumping, we should have seen impact marks, disturbed vegetation, something that indicated a hard landing. "Maybe they're from 2 different people," Logan said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. Same boot brand, same size, same depth, both pointed in the exact same direction, I said. These prints are connected somehow. We continued west, and over the next 20 minutes we found 4 more single prints, each one separated from the last by between 35 and 50 feet. Each print was identical in brand and approximate size, and all were pointed west with remarkable consistency. But there was something else I'd started to notice, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The prints were getting bigger. Not dramatically bigger, and if I hadn't been paying close attention, I might not have noticed at all. But when I measured the first print with my pocket ruler, it had been about 11 inches long. The most recent print I'd measured was almost 12 inches. The boot size was increasing with each step, as if the person making the prints was somehow growing as they walked. I didn't share this observation with Logan yet. I needed to confirm it first, needed to make sure I wasn't seeing patterns that didn't actually exist. The human mind is very good at finding meaning in randomness, and in stressful situations like search and rescue operations, it's easy to start seeing things that aren't really there. We kept following the trail of single prints deeper into the forest. The terrain was getting rougher, with more elevation changes and more obstacles to navigate around. We were now at least a quarter mile from the main trail, in an area where most hikers never ventured. The forest here was older, the trees larger and more widely spaced, and the undergrowth had thinned out due to the heavy shade of the canopy. The 7th print we found was in a small clearing where a massive old pine tree had fallen years ago and created a gap in the canopy. Sunlight streamed down into the clearing, and in the center, pressed into a patch of exposed dirt, was another single boot print. This one was definitely bigger. I measured it carefully, 13.5 inches long. I checked my notes to confirm, and yes, the progression was undeniable. The prints were growing larger with each step. I stood up and looked around the clearing, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Marcus Brennan had come this way, I was certain of that now. These prints had to be his. But what was happening to him? Was he injured? Walking in some strange limping gait that only put weight on 1 foot every 40 feet? That didn't make any medical sense. Was someone carrying him, only setting him down briefly before picking him up again? But why would they do that, and where were the carrier's footprints? "Ruth," Logan's voice was tight. "You need to see this." He was kneeling on the far side of the clearing, examining something on the ground. I walked over and looked down at what he'd found. It was a small pile of pine needles, fresh and green, with a few small twigs mixed in. Nothing remarkable about that except for one detail. We were in a mixed hardwood forest dominated by maple, birch, and beech trees. The nearest pine trees were back near the trailhead, at least a quarter mile behind us. I picked up one of the needles and examined it. It was definitely from a white pine, probably broken off within the last day or two based on how much sap was still visible at the break point. But there were no pine trees anywhere in this clearing or in the surrounding forest. "He must have brought these with him," Logan said. "Maybe they got stuck to his jacket or his pack when he walked past a pine tree earlier." That was the only explanation that made sense, but something about it bothered me. The needles weren't scattered randomly like they'd fallen off someone's clothing. They were arranged in a small, neat pile, like someone had deliberately placed them there, and the quantity seemed too large to have accidentally accumulated on someone's gear. We kept moving west, following the line of increasingly large single footprints. The 8th print measured 14 inches. The 9th was 15.5 inches. At the 10th print, I stopped and pulled Logan aside. "These prints are getting bigger," I said quietly. "I need you to confirm. I'm not imagining this." Logan's face had gone pale. I noticed that too. I didn't want to say anything because it doesn't make any sense. "Nothing about this makes sense," I agreed. "But we need to keep following them. Marcus Brennan is somewhere ahead of us and he needs help." Though, even as I said it, I was starting to wonder if the person we were following was really Marcus Brennan at all. We continued tracking the single footprints for another 45 minutes, venturing deeper into a section of wilderness that rarely saw human visitors. The forest here had a different quality to it, older and more primeval somehow. The trees were massive, some of them probably 200 or 300 years old, and the silence was profound. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. The only sound was our own breathing and the soft crunch of our boots on the forest floor. The prints continued to grow with each occurrence. By the time we found the 14th print, it measured almost 17 inches long and was so deep that I could see clear impressions of every lug and tread pattern in the boot sole. Whatever was making these prints was carrying tremendous weight now, far more than a human being should weigh even with a heavy pack. And then we found something that changed everything. The 15th print was at the edge of a small rocky outcropping, pressed into a patch of moss that had somehow survived in the thin soil between the stones. The print measured 18 inches long, and next to it, lying on the rock surface, was a driver's license. I picked it up carefully, holding it by the edges. The photo showed a young man with dark hair and a friendly smile. The name read Marcus Brennan, address in Brooklyn, date of birth indicating he was 28 years old. This was our missing hiker. At least we know we're on the right track, Logan said. But I wasn't so sure. If these prints belonged to Marcus Brennan, then Marcus Brennan was now wearing boots that were impossibly large and walking with an impossibly long stride. And he was leaving his identification behind him like breadcrumbs. I radioed our position back to the command post, giving Patricia our coordinates and updating her on what we'd found. Her response was characteristically professional, but I could hear the concern in her voice. "Copy that, Ruth. Keep following the trail, but stay alert. We're sending additional teams to your location as backup. Should reach you in approximately 45 minutes. 45 minutes. A lot could happen in 45 minutes, especially this deep in the wilderness where help was so far away. I looked at Logan and could see he was thinking the same thing. "We keep going," I said, carefully. The terrain was getting more difficult now, with steep rocky slopes and loose scree that made for treacherous footing. We had to slow our pace to avoid injury, and I was acutely aware of how isolated we were. The nearest other human beings were miles away, and if something went wrong out here, we were on our own. The 16th print we found was at the base of a steep rocky slope, pressed into a narrow band of soil between two large boulders. It measured 19.5 inches. I stood staring at it for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. A boot print 19.5 inches long would require a foot of impossible proportions. No human being had feet that large. Even accounting for thick socks and oversized boots, we were talking about something that simply couldn't exist. "Ruth," Logan's voice shook slightly. "I think we need to call this in and wait for backup." He was right. I knew he was right, but I also knew that Marcus Brennan was somewhere ahead of us and might not have 45 minutes to wait for additional help. Every instinct I'd developed over 16 years of search and rescue work was screaming at me that time was critical, that if we stopped now, we might lose our chance to find him alive. "Just a little further," I said. "If we don't find anything in the next 10 minutes, we'll hold position and wait for backup." Logan didn't look happy about it, but he nodded and followed me as I began climbing the rocky slope. The going was slow and difficult, with loose rocks shifting under our boots and forcing us to test each handhold before trusting our weight to it. About halfway up the slope, I found another small pile of pine needles, this one tucked into a crevice between two rocks. Again, they appeared to have been deliberately placed rather than randomly deposited. When we reached the top of the slope, we found ourselves on a relatively flat ridgeline with a clear view of the surrounding mountains. The sun was getting lower in the sky now, maybe 3 hours from sunset, and the temperature was starting to drop. If Marcus Brennan was out here injured or incapacitated, he wouldn't survive another night in these conditions. The 17th print was near the center of the ridge, in a patch of bare dirt that looked like it had been deliberately cleared of vegetation. The print measured 21 inches long. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My own boots, which were size 8.5 women's, were 12 inches long. The print I was staring at was nearly twice that size. Whatever had made this print was wearing boots that were larger than my own boots could ever hope to be. I was about to voice this observation to Logan when I heard something that froze me in place. It was a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before in the Adirondacks, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then faded away into silence. "What was that?" Logan whispered. "I don't know." We stood perfectly still, listening. For a long moment there was nothing, just the normal forest sound slowly resuming after whatever had made that noise pass through. Then I heard it again, that same deep thrumming, slightly louder this time and seemingly coming from somewhere ahead of us on the ridgeline. "We should wait for backup," Logan said more forcefully this time. But before I could respond, I saw movement in the forest ahead. Something large was moving between the trees, heading in our direction. For a moment I thought it might be a bear, but the shape was wrong, too vertical and deliberate in its movements. And then he stepped out into the open, and I saw Marcus Brennan. Except it wasn't Marcus Brennan, not anymore, not entirely. The man walking toward us across the ridge was wearing Marcus Brennan's red jacket and carrying Marcus Brennan's blue backpack. But he'd changed in ways that defied explanation. He was taller, maybe 7 feet instead of the 5'10" listed on his driver's license. His proportions were subtly wrong, arms too long and legs too thick. And his boots, his hiking boots that had started the day as a normal size 10, had somehow grown to match his transformed feet. He was walking with a strange limping gait, putting all his weight on his right foot for one step, then lifting completely off the ground before coming down on his right foot again 40 feet later. The left foot never touched the ground at all. It simply dangled uselessly as he moved in those impossible leaping strides. When he saw us, he stopped and stared. His face was Marcus Brennan's face. I could see that clearly, but his expression was one of such profound confusion and fear that it was hard to look at him directly. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but what came out was that deep, thrumming sound again, vibrating through my chest and making my teeth ache. "Marcus," I called out, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could manage. "Marcus Brennan, we're here to help you." He took a step toward us, and I could see now how wrong his movement was. It wasn't a walk or a run or even a hop. It was something else entirely, a single-footed propulsion that launched him forward and up before gravity pulled him back down 40 feet later. And with each landing, I could hear a sound like wood creaking under enormous pressure. Logan had backed up several steps and had his radio out, speaking urgently into it. I could only catch fragments. "Need immediate medical evac. Something wrong with the missing hiker. Not sure how to describe." I stood my ground, one hand held up in what I hoped was a calming gesture. "Marcus, can you understand me? We're park rangers. Your friends reported you missing. We're here to bring you home." He took another of those strange, leaping steps toward us, and I could see his eyes now. They were Marcus Brennan's eyes. Same color, same shape, but filled with a terrible awareness. He knew what was happening to him. He knew he was changing into something that shouldn't exist, and he was terrified. When he opened his mouth again, that thrumming sound emerged once more. But this time I could hear words buried in it, distorted and bass-heavy but still recognizable. "Help me." "We're going to help you," I said, though I had no idea how. "Just stay calm. We have medical personnel coming. They'll..." He interrupted me with another leap forward, and this time, when his boot came down on the rocky ridge, the stone beneath it cracked with a sound like a gunshot. He was getting heavier with each step, denser, as if his body was accumulating mass from somewhere. And then I understood what the pine needles meant. "Logan," I said, quietly, not taking my eyes off Marcus. "What trees were closest to where he parked his car yesterday?" "What? The parking lot. What kind of trees are around it?" Logan thought for a moment. "White pines, mostly. Why does that? Oh, God." He'd made the same connection I had. The pine needles weren't something Marcus had accidentally picked up on his clothing. They were something he was leaving behind, deliberately marking his trail. Because as he walked, as he grew and changed, he was incorporating material from his environment into his body. The soil he walked on, the vegetation he passed through, even the stone beneath his feet, it was all becoming part of him, adding to his mass and size with each impossible step. Marcus took another leap toward us, and this time I could see fragments of stone and soil embedded in the sole of his boot, fused there as if they'd always been part of the original material. He was now maybe 100 feet away, close enough that I could see tears running down his transformed face. "How do we stop this?" Logan asked desperately. "I don't think we can," I said. "I don't think anyone can." The medical evacuation helicopter we'd requested would arrive in maybe 20 minutes. But what were they supposed to do? How do you treat someone who's literally becoming part of the landscape they're walking through? How do you reverse a transformation that shouldn't be biologically possible? Marcus made one more leap toward us, and when his boot came down this time, the entire ridge seemed to shudder. Cracks radiated out from the impact point like a spider web. He was now almost 8 feet tall, his clothing stretched tight over his enlarged frame. And he was still growing. That's when I made a decision that probably saved our lives. I grabbed Logan's arm and pulled him toward the edge of the ridge. "We need to move, now." "But Marcus is beyond our help. If he gets any bigger, if he gets any heavier, that next step is going to bring this whole ridge down." We scrambled down the slope we'd just climbed, half running and half sliding over the loose rocks. Behind us, I could hear Marcus's thrumming voice, could hear the impact of his increasingly massive boots hitting stone. The whole mountain seemed to be vibrating with each of his steps now. I risked one more glance back and saw Marcus attempting to follow us, his transformed body struggling to navigate the steep descent. Each impact of his boot sent fractures racing through the bedrock, and I realized with horror that his weight was no longer something the mountain could support. He'd become too heavy, too dense, too much of the mountain itself concentrated into one impossible form. The thrumming sound that emerged from him had changed pitch now, becoming almost song-like, though the melody was alien and discordant. It reminded me of recordings I'd heard of glacier ice cracking deep within its mass, or the low-frequency rumble of distant earthquakes. This was the sound of geological processes compressed into human-scaled time frames, the song of stone and soil given voice. "Ruth, we need to move faster," Logan shouted. But I couldn't look away from what was happening behind us. Marcus had stopped moving down the slope. He stood perfectly still for a moment, his enlarged form silhouetted against the afternoon sky, and I saw him raise one hand to his face. Even from this distance, I could see he was crying, his transformed body still somehow capable of producing that most human of responses to terror and grief. He knew what he was becoming. He understood that there was no way back from this, no medical intervention that could reverse what the mountain had done to him. And then, something even stranger happened. The ground beneath Marcus's right foot began to glow with a faint phosphorescent light, as if some chemical reaction was taking place at the point of contact. The glow spread up through his boot, into his leg, through his torso until his entire body was outlined in that eerie luminescence. He looked like a figure carved from moonlight, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The thrumming changed again, and this time I definitely heard words. Tell them, I didn't mean to, didn't know. We'll tell them, I shouted back, my voice cracking. We'll tell them, Marcus, I promise. Whether he heard me or not, I'll never know. The glow intensified, becoming almost painful to look at directly. Logan had pulled out his phone and was trying to record what was happening, though I knew instinctively that no camera would be able to capture what we were witnessing. Some things exist at frequencies or in dimensions that technology can't perceive. We'd made it about 200 feet when I heard a sound like thunder and looked back to see the ridgeline where we'd been standing moments before beginning to collapse. Marcus stood at the center of the collapse, now easily 10 feet tall and still growing, his arms spread wide as if trying to maintain balance. The phosphorescent glow had faded, leaving him looking solid and real and impossibly large. For just a moment, our eyes met across the distance. Even transformed as he was, I could see the person he'd been in those eyes. The young man from Brooklyn who'd been so excited to hike the Adirondacks, who'd told his friends he'd meet them at the summit, who'd had no idea that his first day on these trails would be his last day as a human being. And then, with a final, desperate leap, he launched himself off the crumbling ridge. He never came down. I watched, Logan watched, and we both saw the same impossible thing. Marcus Brennan, transformed into something that was more mountain than man, rose into the air on that final, single-footed leap and simply kept rising. He rose above the tree line, above the ridge, above the summit of Whiteface Mountain itself. But the rising wasn't smooth or peaceful. His body was convulsing, shaking apart even as it climbed higher. I could see fragments breaking off, first small pieces like gravel, then larger chunks like boulders. Each piece that separated from him glowed briefly with that same phosphorescent light before winking out and falling back toward the mountain. The thrumming sound became a roar, then a shriek, then something beyond sound entirely, a vibration that I felt in my bones and teeth and the base of my skull. Logan dropped to his knees beside me, hands pressed over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound, or whatever it was, bypassed our ears entirely and resonated directly in our bodies. And as Marcus rose higher, he began to dissolve more rapidly, his body breaking apart into millions of particles that caught the afternoon light and sparkled like snow. But it wasn't random dissolution. The particles were arranging themselves into patterns as they dispersed, forming shapes that looked almost like letters or symbols in some unknown alphabet. They hung in the air for perhaps 5 seconds. This impossible text, written in the scattered remains of Marcus Brennan, and then the wind caught them and blew them apart. Within 30 seconds, there was nothing left of him at all except a few scraps of red fabric drifting down through the air and landing among the rocks. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. The forest held its breath, and so did we. I don't know how long Logan and I sat there on that slope, staring at the empty sky where Marcus had vanished. Time seemed to have stopped or become meaningless. The sun was in the same position it had been, the shadows hadn't moved, but I felt like hours might have passed. Finally, Logan spoke, his voice hoarse and shaking. "Did you see the patterns? When he came apart, did you see—" "I saw them," I said quietly. "I don't know what they meant. Ruth, we have to tell someone. We have to report exactly what we saw." I looked at him, saw the mixture of trauma and determination in his face, and felt something inside me break. Tell them what, Logan? That we watched a man turn into a giant and then dissolve into particles in the sky? That the mountain itself transformed him into something that violated every law of physics we know? Who's going to believe that? The evidence? What evidence? Some boot prints, a few pine needles, his driver's license that tells us nothing except that he was here. I shook my head. We have no evidence of what actually happened. And even if we did, even if we somehow had video footage or physical proof, what good would it do? Could we stop it from happening to someone else? Could we close the mountain to hikers? Could we warn people that if they walk these trails, they might be absorbed into the landscape and transformed into something impossible? Logan didn't answer because he knew I was right. We had witnessed something that couldn't be explained or prevented, or even properly discussed with anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. All we could do was carry the knowledge forward and hope it never happened again. The radio crackled to life, Patricia Hollis's voice cutting through our shocked silence. "Ruth, Logan, what's your status? The backup teams are approaching your last known position." I picked up my radio with trembling hands. We're safe, Patricia." Ridge collapse forced us to retreat. No sign of the missing hiker. Recommend pulling back all search teams until we can assess terrain stability. There was a pause, then, "Copy that. Mark your position and head back to command post. We'll debrief when you get here." I looked at Logan. "We stick to the basic facts. Ridge collapse, unstable terrain, no body recovered. Agreed?" He nodded slowly. "Agreed. But Ruth, I'm going to remember this for the rest of my life. Those patterns he made when he dissolved, I can still see them when I close my eyes." "I know," I said. "So can I." We made our way back down the mountain in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own attempts to process what we'd witnessed. Behind us, the forest slowly came back to life. Birds began to sing again. Insects resumed their buzzing. The wind picked up and rustled through the leaves. It was as if the mountain had decided that the show was over, that normal operations could resume now that Marcus Brennan had been claimed and transformed and released. But I knew that nothing would ever be normal for me again. I'd crossed a threshold that day, stepped through an invisible boundary between the world I thought I understood and a much stranger, much more terrifying reality that existed just beneath the surface of everyday experience. The mountain had shown me its true nature, and now I could never unsee it. The official report stated that Marcus Brennan's body was never recovered, and that the most likely explanation for his disappearance was that he had fallen from one of the many cliff faces on Whiteface Mountain, and his remains had been scattered by wildlife or buried under rockfall. The search was suspended after 2 weeks with no additional evidence found. Logan and I never mentioned what we'd actually seen on that ridge. When Patricia Hollis asked us to describe what happened, we stuck to the facts that could be verified. We'd followed a trail of single boot prints into the wilderness. We'd encountered terrain instability that caused a partial ridge collapse, and we'd been forced to retreat for our own safety without locating the missing hiker. All of that was technically true. The driver's license we'd found was returned to Marcus Brennan's family, along with a few other personal effects that subsequent search teams recovered from the general area. I attended the memorial service in Brooklyn 3 weeks later, standing in the back of a crowded funeral home and listening to Marcus's friends and family talk about what a vibrant, adventurous person he'd been. His mother spoke about how much he'd loved hiking, how he'd been planning this Adirondack trip for months, how excited he'd been to finally experience the wilderness he'd only seen in photographs. I watched her hands shake as she held the microphone, saw the way her voice broke when she talked about the last conversation she'd had with her son. He'd called her from the parking lot at Whiteface, full of enthusiasm and energy, telling her about the beautiful day and how he couldn't wait to get on the trail. That phone call had lasted maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes of normal mother-son conversation, neither of them knowing it would be their last. Marcus's father stood beside his wife with one arm around her shoulders. his face carved into an expression of controlled grief that I recognized from years of delivering bad news to families. He was holding it together because he had to, because breaking down wouldn't help anyone. But I could see the cost of that control in the tension of his jaw and the hollowness of his eyes. The funeral home was full of Marcus's friends, young people in their 20s and 30s, many of them wearing hiking boots or outdoor gear in tribute to their missing friend. They'd brought photographs, hundreds of them, displayed on boards around the room. Marcus at various trailheads, Marcus at mountain summits, Marcus with his backpack and his characteristic broad smile. In every picture he looked healthy and happy and full of life, completely unaware that his passion for the outdoors would lead him to a fate worse than any conventional death. One of his hiking partners, a young woman named Sarah, spoke about the last time she'd seen Marcus alive. She described how excited he'd been that morning, how he'd insisted on going solo for this one hike because he wanted to challenge himself, to prove he could handle the Adirondacks on his own. He was always pushing himself to be braver, to go further, she said through tears. He wanted to become the kind of person who could handle anything the wilderness threw at him. The irony of those words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had gotten exactly what he'd wanted. The wilderness had thrown something at him, and he'd handled it in the only way possible. He'd absorbed it, become it, transcended it in the most literal sense imaginable, but the cost had been his humanity, his identity, his very existence as a separate being. I didn't tell them what had happened to their son. What could I have said that wouldn't have sounded insane? Your son didn't fall off a cliff. He transformed into something impossible, growing larger with each step, incorporating the very mountain itself into his body until he literally became too large and too heavy to exist. Oh, and then he dissolved into particles of light and vanished, but not before arranging those particles into symbols we couldn't read in a language we don't understand. No, I couldn't say any of that. It would have been cruel and unbelievable. But standing there in that funeral home, surrounded by Marcus's grieving loved ones, I felt the weight of what I knew pressing down on me like a physical burden. They deserved the truth. They deserved to know that their son and friend and brother hadn't simply fallen to his death in some random accident. What happened to Marcus was specific and strange and somehow meaningful in ways I still didn't fully understand. After the service, Marcus's mother approached me. She'd been told that I was one of the rangers who'd searched for her son, and she wanted to thank me for my efforts, even though we hadn't been able to bring him home. "Was there anything?" she asked quietly. "Any sign at all of what might have happened to him?" I looked into her eyes and saw a mother's desperate need for answers, for some kind of closure that would let her begin to process her loss. And I made a decision that I've questioned every day since. "He walked into the wilderness," I told her, choosing my words carefully. "And the wilderness took him. I don't think he suffered at the end. I think he became part of something larger than himself. It wasn't the truth, not exactly, but it wasn't entirely a lie either." Marcus's mother studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression, a recognition perhaps that I knew more than I was saying, but also an acceptance that some questions can't be answered in ways that make conventional sense. "Thank you," she said finally. "Thank you for looking for him." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, and watched as she turned away to accept condolences from other attendees. I left the funeral home shortly after, walking out into the gray Brooklyn afternoon, and feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. But that doesn't mean I stopped thinking about it. Over the following months, I began doing research into the history of Whiteface Mountain, looking for any previous incidents that might shed light on what had happened to Marcus Brennan. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. Dating back to the early 1800s, there were periodic reports of hikers vanishing on Whiteface under circumstances that were never adequately explained. Not every year, not even every decade, but regularly enough to establish a pattern if you knew to look for it. In 1837, a surveyor named Jonathan Pritchard disappeared while mapping the mountain. Search parties found a trail of his equipment scattered over 2 miles, but no body and no indication of what had happened to him. His compass was found wedged into a crack in solid bedrock, as if it had been driven there with tremendous force. In 1892, 3 loggers working on the lower slopes of the mountain failed to return to camp. When their coworkers went looking for them, they found a bizarre trail leading up the mountain. Bootprints that started normal-sized but grew progressively larger until they were, as one contemporary account put it, large enough for a giant to wear. The trail ended at a rock face where all 3 men's lunch pails were found stacked neatly on a narrow ledge 30 feet off the ground. In 1934, a geology professor from Columbia University vanished while conducting field research on Whiteface. His notebook was recovered, and the final entries described peculiar magnetic anomalies and localized gravity fluctuations that he couldn't explain. The last sentence he wrote was, "I feel strange, as if I'm becoming part of what I'm studying." In 1967, a teenage boy disappeared during a family camping trip. His father told searchers that he'd seen his son walking away from their campsite in the middle of the night, moving with long, bouncing steps like an astronaut on the moon. The boy's boots were later found at the base of a cliff, size 11 when he'd started wearing size 7 at the beginning of the hike. Every few decades, Whiteface Mountain took someone. Always hikers or others who spent extended time in close contact with the mountain. Always leaving behind trails of inexplicable evidence. Always vanishing completely without their bodies ever being recovered. I compiled all of this information into an unofficial report that I kept in a locked file in my home office. I didn't share it with anyone except Logan, and even he seemed reluctant to acknowledge what we both knew was true. Some places, he said, weren't meant for human beings. Some places had their own rules, their own logic, and if you spent too much time there, you risked becoming subject to those rules, whether you wanted to or not. Whiteface Mountain was one of those places. The question that haunted me, that still haunts me, is why? What was it about that particular mountain that caused this transformation? And why did it only happen to some people and not others? Thousands of hikers walked Whiteface's trails every year without incident. What made Marcus Brennan different? What made all the previous victims different? I spent hours analyzing the pattern of single footprints we'd followed, trying to understand the mechanism of the transformation. The prints had grown steadily larger, yes, but they'd also been spaced at increasingly regular intervals, as if Marcus was being pulled along a predetermined path. And the pine needles, those carefully placed piles of pine needles that had no business being in a hardwood forest, suggested that some part of Marcus had retained enough awareness to leave markers for us to follow. 6 months after the incident, I requested a transfer out of the High Peaks region. My supervisor was surprised. I'd been working that area for my entire career and was considered an expert on the terrain and trails, but I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't continue working in a place where I'd witnessed something that shattered my understanding of what was possible in the natural world. I'm now stationed in the western Adirondacks, covering an area around the Fulton chain of lakes. It's beautiful country, and the work is satisfying in ways that High Peaks search and rescue never was. Fewer emergencies, more routine patrol work, less likelihood of encountering anything that challenges my grip on reality. Logan left the DC entirely. Last I heard, he was working as a wilderness guide in Alaska, as far from the Adirondacks as he could get while still staying in a profession that involved outdoor work. We don't keep in touch. I think we both prefer it that way. Some experiences create a bond between people, but others create a shared burden that's too heavy to carry in each other's presence. The one thing I did keep from that day was a single pine needle I'd picked up from one of the piles Marcus left behind. I pressed it in a book and preserved it, a small, tangible reminder that what Logan and I saw was real. On difficult nights when I start to convince myself that I imagined the whole thing, that it was stress-induced hallucination or shared delusion, I take out that pine needle and examine it under a magnifying glass. The needle is covered in microscopic scratches and indentations that form patterns I don't recognize. They might be random damage from being carried in Marcus's pack. Or they might be something else, some kind of marking or writing in a language I don't understand. I've never shown the needle to anyone or tried to have it analyzed. Some questions are better left unanswered. I still follow the missing persons reports from the High Peaks region. It's a morbid compulsion, but I can't seem to stop myself. Most of the disappearances are resolved quickly and conventionally. Hikers found lost on side trails, injured climbers rescued by helicopter, occasionally a body recovered after a genuine accident. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggests the mountain is continuing its pattern. But I know it's just a matter of time. If history is any guide, sometime in the next few years, someone else will go hiking on Whiteface Mountain and not come back. Search teams will follow trails of increasingly large single footprints into the wilderness. They'll find carefully placed pine needles in impossible locations. And if they're unlucky enough to actually catch up with the missing hiker, they'll witness the same transformation Logan and I witnessed. I've thought about going public with what I know, warning people away from Whiteface Mountain entirely. But who would believe me? And even if they did, would it matter? The mountain is protected wilderness. It's not going anywhere. People have a right to hike there, to experience the beauty and majesty of the high peaks. What right do I have to rob them of that experience based on events that happen once or twice in a generation? So I keep my silence, and I live with the knowledge of what's waiting on Whiteface Mountain for the next person who happens to be susceptible to its influence. I imagine Marcus Brennan's particles are still up there somewhere, dispersed through the atmosphere above the summit, neither alive nor dead, but transformed into something that exists in a state we have no words to describe. Sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is full, and I happen to be looking north toward the high peaks, I can see a faint glow above where Whiteface Mountain stands. Most people would dismiss it as light pollution from Lake Placid or some atmospheric phenomenon. But I know better. I know that glow is Marcus Brennan and all the others who came before him, trapped in an eternal loop of transformation and dissolution, forever falling, and forever rising above the mountain that claimed them. The Adirondacks are ancient. These mountains were here millions of years before the first human beings walked the earth, and they'll be here millions of years after we're gone. We think of them as wilderness that we've preserved, as if the land exists for our benefit and under our protection. But the truth is exactly the opposite. We exist at the mountain's sufferance, and if we forget that fact, if we presume too much or push too hard against boundaries we don't understand, the mountain has ways of reminding us of our place. Marcus Brennan learned that lesson. So did Jonathan Pritchard, and those 3 loggers, and the geology professor and all the others whose names have been lost to time. They went into the wilderness thinking they were explorers, adventurers, students of nature. Instead, they became part of the very thing they were trying to understand, absorbed into the ancient stone and soil and air until nothing remained of them but traces and memories and warnings that nobody seems to heed. I still love the Adirondacks. I still find profound meaning in the work I do protecting and preserving these wild places. But I approach that work with a level of humility and caution that I didn't have before that October day when I followed a trail of impossible footprints into the wilderness and found something that shouldn't exist. The mountain ranger's oath includes a promise to protect the resources entrusted to our care. But what I learned on Whiteface Mountain is that sometimes the resources don't need our protection. Sometimes it's the other way around, and we're the ones who need to be careful not to trespass against forces that are older and stranger and more powerful than we can comprehend. There's a quote attributed to John Muir that I used to have hanging on my office wall. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. I took that quote down after the Marcus Brennan incident, because now I understand it has a darker interpretation, one that John Muir probably never intended, but that's no less true for that. Sometimes what you receive from nature isn't wisdom or peace or spiritual enlightenment. Sometimes it's a transformation you never asked for and can't reverse. Sometimes nature takes from you rather than giving to you, claiming you as its own, and incorporating you into systems and processes that operate on scales of time and space that make human life seem like the briefest flicker of insignificance. Marcus Brennan went hiking on a beautiful October morning, full of excitement and anticipation for the adventure ahead. He never came home. His body was never found. And somewhere above Whiteface Mountain, particles that used to be a 28-year-old man from Brooklyn still drift through the upper atmosphere, neither alive nor dead, transformed into something that defies every law of biology and physics we think we understand. I tell this story not because I expect anyone to believe it, but because I need to tell it. 16 years as a park ranger taught me a lot about wilderness survival and search and rescue operations. But one October day on Whiteface Mountain taught me something far more important. There are places in this world where the ordinary rules don't apply, where reality itself becomes fluid and malleable, where the boundary between human and landscape can dissolve if you're not careful. The High Peaks wilderness is one of those places. The mountains are patient, the mountains are old, and the mountains remember. And every few decades they reach out and claim one of us, pulling us into transformations we can't understand and can't resist, until all that's left is a trail of mysteriously growing footprints and a few scattered possessions that tell only the barest outline of what really happened. If you ever find yourself hiking Whiteface Mountain, and you notice a trail of single boot prints leading off into the wilderness, prints that seem too far apart to be from a normal human stride, I have one piece of advice for you. Don't follow them. Call the ranger station, report what you've seen, and then get off that mountain as quickly as you can, because the next transformation might be yours, and once it starts, there's no way to stop it. You'll walk and leap and grow, incorporating the mountain into your body and your body into the mountain, until finally you launch yourself skyward on one last impossible stride and dissolve into particles of light that will hang above the summit forever. A warning that nobody will understand and that most people won't even notice. The wilderness is beautiful and terrible in equal measure. It gives life and it takes life. It nurtures and it destroys. And sometimes, very rarely, it transforms. Marcus Brennan learned that truth too late to save himself. I learned it just in time to save Logan and myself. But I'll never forget those impossible footprints, growing larger with each step, or the sight of a young man launching himself into the sky and vanishing into light. Some images burn themselves into your memory so deeply that they become part of who you are, changing you in ways both subtle and profound. The mountain changed Marcus Brennan in obvious physical ways. But it changed me too, in ways that are harder to see but no less real. I look at wilderness differently now. I approach the wild places with more respect and more caution. And I never, ever take for granted that I understand what I'm dealing with when I step off the trail and into the deep forest where humans are visitors and the mountain makes its own rules. That's the real lesson of Whiteface Mountain, the one I wish I could communicate to every hiker and camper and wilderness enthusiast who ventures into the Adirondacks each year. You're not in control out there. You never were. And if you're very unlucky, you might encounter something that reminds you of that fact in the most terrifying way possible. The single footprint on Whiteface Trail was the beginning of a transformation that ended with a man becoming something that couldn't exist, and then ceasing to exist entirely. It was impossible, and it happened. I watched it happen, and somewhere, deep in the core of Whiteface Mountain, in stone and soil and the very substance of the earth itself, Marcus Brennan still exists in some form we have no names for. The mountain remembers. The mountain always remembers, and that's both a comfort and a terror that I carry with me every single day. My name is Benjamin Harlo, and I've been working as a ranger for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation for the past 13 years. Most of that time has been spent in the Adirondack Park, specifically in the region around the Saranac Lakes, a chain of interconnected waterways that wind through some of the most remote and beautiful wilderness in the northeastern United States. It's the kind of place where you can paddle for hours without seeing another person, where the silence is so complete that the sound of a loon's call across the water seems almost unnaturally loud. I didn't grow up in the Adirondacks. I'm from Utica originally, a small city about 90 miles south of where I work now. My path to becoming a ranger was circuitous. I spent my early 20s drifting through various jobs, never quite finding anything that felt like a calling until a friend invited me on a camping trip to the High Peaks region. Something about those mountains and lakes spoke to me in a way nothing else ever had. Within 6 months, I'd enrolled in a forestry program, and within 2 years, I was working seasonal positions for the DEC. The rest, as they say, is history. The thing about working in wilderness law enforcement is that you develop a particular set of instincts over time. You learn to read landscapes, to notice when something is out of place or doesn't quite fit the pattern you'd expect. A broken branch that suggests someone went off trail, trash that indicates illegal camping, disturbed soil that might mean poaching or unauthorized tree cutting. These small details become second nature after enough time in the field, and you stop consciously analyzing them. Your brain just flags them automatically. Wrong, unusual, investigate further. That's exactly what happened on the morning of June 8th, when I was doing a routine patrol of the remote cabins scattered around Lower Saranac Lake. These cabins are relics from an earlier era, most of them built in the 1920s and 30s, when the area was first being developed for recreation. Some are still privately owned and maintained, but many have been abandoned over the decades as families died out or lost interest in maintaining property that's only accessible by boat. The DEC keeps an eye on these abandoned structures, checking them periodically for signs of unauthorized use, structural damage, or environmental hazards. I was working with Diane Mercer that day, a fellow ranger who'd transferred to our region about 2 years earlier from the Catskills. Diane was in her mid-40s, methodical and observant, with a dry sense of humor that made long patrol days more bearable. She'd grown up in rural Pennsylvania and had that particular brand of woods wisdom that comes from a childhood spent actually living in close proximity to wilderness, rather than just visiting it on weekends. We started our patrol around 7 that morning, launching my boat from the Fish Creek Pond boat launch and motoring south toward Lower Saranac Lake. It was one of those perfect June mornings that make you remember why you chose this profession. The air was cool and clean, the water was calm as glass, and the early morning mist was just beginning to burn off the lake surface. The forecast called for clear skies all day with temperatures in the mid-70s, ideal conditions for being on the water. Our route would take us past about 15 abandoned cabins scattered along the more remote sections of the shoreline. Most of them we could inspect from the boat using binoculars, but a few required closer examination, especially if we noticed any signs that someone might have been using them. Squatters were a persistent problem in these old structures, people looking for free accommodation or wanting to hide from whatever troubles they'd left behind in the civilized world. We'd checked about 8 cabins without finding anything unusual when we reached a particularly isolated structure on the western shore of the lake, tucked into a small cove and surrounded by dense stands of white pine and hemlock. The cabin was called the Morrison Place, named after the family that had built it back in 1927. I'd been inside it maybe a dozen times over the years, always finding it in the same state of genteel decay. Dusty furniture slowly rotting, windows clouded with grime, walls stained with water damage from a roof that had given up any pretense of being waterproof decades ago. As we approached the Morrison Place in the boat, Diane was the first to notice something odd. "Ben, look at the dock." I cut the motor and let us drift closer, following her gaze. The cabin's dock was in surprisingly good condition considering how long it had been since anyone maintained it, probably because it was built from old-growth cedar that resisted rot better than newer lumber. But what Diane had noticed wasn't the dock itself. It was what was on it. There were wet footprints on the gray-weathered planks, clearly visible in the morning sun. Not just 1 or 2 prints either, but a trail of them leading from the water's edge up to the cabin's front door. The prints were already starting to dry in the morning air, but they were fresh enough that I could make out the tread pattern. Work boots, probably size 9 or 10, and whoever had made them had been moving quickly. The stride length suggested running, or at least a very fast walk. "Could be fishermen," I said, though something about the situation didn't feel right. "At this cabin?" Diane shook her head. "The fishing's terrible in this cove, and anyway, why would they go inside? Everyone knows these old places are structurally unsound." She was right. We needed to check it out. I brought the boat up to the dock and tied off while Diane grabbed her pack and radio. We both kept our sidearms accessible but not drawn. Most encounters in situations like this ended peacefully, but it paid to be prepared. The wet footprints were even more clearly defined up close. I knelt down and touched one of them, feeling the moisture. These are maybe 20 minutes old, I estimated. Whoever made them is probably still in the area. We followed the prints to the cabin's front door, which stood slightly ajar. That by itself wasn't necessarily suspicious. These old doors often didn't latch properly anymore, and wind could push them open. But combined with the fresh footprints, it suggested someone had recently entered the structure. I knocked on the doorframe and called out, "This is the Department of Environmental Conservation. If anyone's inside, please come out and identify yourself." No response, just the sound of water lapping against the dock behind us and birds calling from the forest. I knocked again, louder this time. "We're coming in. If you're inside, make yourself known." Still nothing. Diane and I exchanged a look, and I pushed the door open slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dimmer interior. The cabin's main room was exactly as I remembered it from my last inspection 6 months ago, a space about 20 by 30 feet with a stone fireplace at one end, a few pieces of ancient furniture slowly collapsing under their own weight, and windows so dirty they admitted more shadow than light. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mildew and rot, the signature scent of abandoned buildings in humid climates. But there was something else, too. A smell I couldn't quite identify at first. Earthy and wet, like fresh soil after rain. That's when I noticed the mud. It was spread across the cabin's floor in irregular patches, still glistening with moisture despite having clearly been there long enough to start drying at the edges. The mud was a dark, gray-brown color, the kind you'd find at the bottom of a lake or pond, and it had been tracked through the room in a pattern that didn't make immediate sense. The footprints I'd seen on the dock had been from work boots, but the mud on the floor showed no clear boot treads at all. It was just mud, distributed in rough smears and patches, as if someone had walked through carrying wet handfuls of it. "What the hell?" Diane said quietly, stepping carefully around the mud patches. "It hasn't rained in over a week. Where did this come from?" She was right. I'd checked the weather reports before we left that morning. The last precipitation in the area had been a brief thunderstorm 9 days ago, and that had been barely enough to settle the dust on the trails. The ground around the cabin had been completely dry when we approached. I knelt down and examined one of the mud patches more closely. It was thick and heavy, the consistency of potter's clay, and embedded in it were small fragments of vegetation. Algae, bits of aquatic plants, things you'd find on a lake bottom rather than in forest soil. This wasn't mud that someone had walked through accidentally. This was mud that someone had brought into the cabin deliberately, though I couldn't imagine why. "Check the other rooms," I told Diane. "See if there's anyone else here." While she moved toward the cabin's 2 small bedrooms, I continued examining the main room. The mud patches formed a rough trail leading from the front door to an old wooden table near the fireplace. On the table, partially obscured by a thin layer of dust, was a single piece of paper. I pulled out a pen from my pocket and used it to carefully lift the paper, not wanting to contaminate potential evidence with my fingerprints. It was ordinary notebook paper, the kind you could buy at any store, and on it someone had written a single line in black ink, 0713. That was all. Just those 4 digits, written in a neat, controlled hand. No explanation, no context, nothing that would tell me what the numbers were supposed to represent. A time, a date, some kind of code. "Ben, you need to see this," Diane called from one of the bedrooms. I carefully set the paper back down and moved to where she was standing in the doorway of the larger bedroom. She was pointing at the floor, where more mud was spread in a pattern that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't just random patches. This was deliberate. Someone had used the mud to write something on the floor, or tried to. The letters were crude and difficult to read, formed by dragging fingers through wet mud, but I could make out what looked like 3 words. She went under. I stared at the mud, writing for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. "Under what?" I finally asked, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew the answer. "Under the water," Diane said quietly. "Ben, I think someone drowned in this lake. Recently. The footprints on the dock," I said. "They were wet, not muddy. Whoever came here walked through water to get here, but they didn't track lake-bottom mud until they got inside the cabin. So they went into the lake somewhere else, dredged up this mud, carried it here, and used it to leave a message." Diane pulled out her radio. "We need to call this in. Get search and rescue out here, drag the lake bottom near this cabin." But something about the sequence didn't make sense to me. Wait, why would someone who just pulled a drowning victim from the lake bring mud here to write a message? Why not just report it normally? Why use mud instead of the pen that wrote that number on the table? Diane considered this. Maybe they're in shock. People do strange things when they're traumatized. That was possible, but it didn't explain everything. I thought about the wet footprints on the dock, now nearly dry in the morning sun. 20 minutes old at most, I'd estimated. Which meant whoever had been here was either still in the immediate area or had left by boat very recently. But we hadn't seen or heard any other boats since we'd arrived at this cove. "Before you call it in," I said slowly, "tell me about the patrol you did yesterday. You covered this area, right?" Diane nodded. "Yeah, I was on the water from about 6 in the morning until noon, checked all the cabins along this shore. Did you see anything unusual? Any boats? Any activity around the Morrison place?" She thought for a moment, then her expression changed. "I heard something. Around 7 in the morning, when I was maybe half a mile north of here. It sounded like a woman screaming, but it only lasted a few seconds and I couldn't pinpoint the direction because of how sound echoes off the water. I circled around looking for the source but didn't find anything. Eventually, I figured it was probably just a bird. Loons can make some pretty unsettling noises." "What time exactly?" I asked, though I already knew what she was going to say. "I noted it in my log." She pulled out her waterproof notebook and flipped through the pages. "Here it is, 7:13 a.m. 07:13, the same numbers written on the paper on the table." Diane and I looked at each other, and I could see my own growing unease reflected in her face. This wasn't just someone playing a prank or leaving a weird message. This was connected to something real, something that had happened at a specific time in a specific place. A woman had screamed at 07:13, and now there was a message suggesting that someone had gone under the water. "We need to call this in," Diane said again, and this time I agreed. She radioed back to headquarters while I did a more thorough search of the cabin, looking for anything else that might give us context. The mud was only in the main room and the one bedroom. The smaller bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and the kitchen area were all clear. The wet footprints from the dock only extended to the front door and then disappeared, which suggested whoever had left them had either been barefoot when they entered the cabin or had removed their boots. In the kitchen, I found more evidence of recent activity. A camping stove on the counter that wasn't there during my last inspection, a few cans of food with recent expiration dates, and, most tellingly, a life jacket hanging on a hook near the back door. The life jacket was women's size medium, bright orange, and completely dry. It looked new, maybe purchased within the last year based on the lack of sun, fading, or wear. I brought the life jacket out to show Diane, who had just finished her radio call. "Search and rescue is mobilizing," she reported. "They'll have boats and divers here within 2 hours. I also requested a forensics team to process this cabin. If something criminal happened here, we need to preserve the scene." "Look what I found in the kitchen," I said, holding up the life jacket. "Someone was staying here recently, and they had proper safety equipment. But they're not here now, and that scream you heard yesterday morning might have been them," Diane finished. "But if they drowned, where's the body? And who left this mud message? Are we looking for 2 people or 1? Those were good questions, and I didn't have answers to any of them. What I did know was that the Morrison place had transformed from a routine abandoned cabin inspection into what might be a crime scene or at the very least the site of a tragic accident. While we waited for backup to arrive, Diane and I secured the cabin and began a preliminary search of the immediate area. The forest around the Morrison place was dense and relatively untouched, without any obvious trails leading away from the lake shore. If someone had left the area on foot rather than by boat, they would have had to bushwhack through thick undergrowth, and we should have been able to find evidence of their passage. We found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed vegetation, no footprints in the soft soil under the trees. It was as if whoever had been at the cabin had simply vanished into thin air, or more likely, had left by boat while we were still approaching from the north. "We should check the water near the dock," I suggested. "If someone went into the lake here, there might be disturbed sediment or other evidence." Diane agreed, and we moved our boat around to get a better angle on the water directly adjacent to the cabin. The lake in this cove was relatively shallow near shore, maybe 10 or 12 feet deep, and the water was clear enough that we could see the bottom in the morning light. That's when I saw the disturbed sediment. A large area of the lake bottom, maybe 15 feet in diameter, looked like it had been recently churned up. The mud and silt that normally lay in an undisturbed layer on the rocky bottom had been mixed and scattered, creating a cloudy area in otherwise clear water. And in the center of the disturbed area, I could see what looked like a depression or trench, as if something heavy had been dragged across the bottom. "Someone was definitely diving here," Diane said, leaning over the side of the boat to get a better look. "That's where the cabin mud came from. They went down, scooped up handfuls of bottom sediment, and brought it inside to write that message." "But why?" I asked. "If they found a body down there, why not just report it? Why leave cryptic messages?" "Maybe they couldn't report it," Diane said slowly. "Maybe whoever drowned was connected to them somehow, and reporting it would implicate them in something. That was one possibility, but it raised more questions than it answered. We were clearly dealing with a situation that was more complex than a simple drowning accident, and until search and rescue arrived with proper diving equipment, we weren't going to be able to answer the most important question. Was there actually a body in this lake? The search and rescue team arrived about 90 minutes later, led by a DEC supervisor named Victor Torres, who I'd worked with on several previous operations. Victor was a 20-year veteran with extensive experience in underwater recovery, and he brought with him 2 certified divers and a boat equipped with sonar scanning equipment. While the divers were suiting up, I briefed Victor on everything we'd found: the wet footprints, the cabin mud, the written message, the life jacket, and most importantly, the time notation that matched when Diane had heard a scream. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a waterproof pad, his expression growing more serious with each detail I added. "Have you run a missing persons check yet?" he asked when I finished. "In progress," Diane said. She'd been on the radio with headquarters for the past 20 minutes, trying to determine if anyone had reported someone missing in the area. "Nothing so far, but that doesn't mean much. If it was a solo hiker or camper, no one might have realized they're missing yet." Victor nodded and turned to watch his divers enter the water. "Let's start with the disturbed area Ben spotted and work outward from there. If there's a body down there, we'll find it." The sonar scan took about 30 minutes, slowly sweeping the area in a grid pattern, while we watched the display screen showing the lake bottom in ghostly green detail. The disturbed sediment showed up clearly on the scan, and we could see that it extended over a larger area than was visible from the surface, maybe 30 feet in diameter rather than 15. And then one of the divers surfaced and gave a signal. They'd found something. We all moved to the rail of the boat, watching as the diver swam to us and pulled off his mask. His name was Jackson, a younger guy who'd only been with the search and rescue team for about a year, and his face had gone pale. "There's something down there," he said, breathing hard. "But it's not a body." "What do you mean?" Victor asked sharply. It's hard to describe. There's a large object buried in the sediment, maybe 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. It looks like it's wrapped in something, canvas or tarp maybe. But whatever it is, it's been down there for a long time. The edges are completely silted over. Not a recent drowning then, but something older." Victor ordered both divers back down with a lifting harness, and over the next hour we watched as they slowly worked to excavate and secure whatever was buried in the lake bottom. The operation was delicate. Disturbing the sediment too much could destroy evidence, and if there were human remains inside the wrapped object, they needed to be recovered intact for identification and cause of death determination. Finally, with all of us watching, the divers brought the object to the surface. It was exactly as Jackson had described, a long bundle wrapped in what looked like old canvas that had been tied with rope at intervals. The canvas was stained dark with mud and decomposition, and as we carefully pulled it aboard, water streamed from it in thick, murky rivulets. "Don't open it here," Victor said. "We need to transport this to the medical examiner's office. If there are human remains inside, they need to be examined in controlled conditions. But even without opening the bundle, we could tell what it contained. The shape was unmistakable, the proportions, the way the canvas had collapsed around it, the weight distribution as we lifted it. This was a body, and based on the advanced state of the canvas decay, it had been in the lake for a considerable amount of time. "How long?" I asked Victor quietly as we secured the bundle in the boat. He shook his head. "Can't say for sure without proper examination, but that canvas looks like it's been underwater for years, not days or weeks. We're talking about an old case, not something that happened yesterday." But that didn't explain the fresh mud in the cabin, or the time notation, or the scream Diane had heard. If this body had been underwater for years, why had someone only now left messages about it? And who had left those messages? As if reading my mind, Diane said, "Someone knew this was down here. Someone who came to the cabin yesterday morning, dove down to where they knew a body was buried, and brought up mud to write a message. The question is who, and why now after all this time?" We transported the bundle back to the main ranger station at Saranac Lake, where it would be picked up by the state medical examiner's office. The forensics team had already begun processing the Morrison Place cabin, carefully documenting the mud patterns and collecting samples for analysis. The paper with the time notation had been photographed and placed in evidence, as had the life jacket and various other items found in the cabin. While we waited for the ME's preliminary findings, I did some research into the Morrison family and the cabin's history. What I found was more disturbing than I'd expected. The Morrison place had been built in 1927 by Thomas Morrison, a wealthy textile manufacturer from Albany, who'd purchased the land as a summer retreat for his family. According to local records, the Morrisons used the cabin regularly through the 1930s and 40s, but sometime in the early 1950s, they stopped coming. The property had been maintained by caretakers for a few more years, then gradually abandoned as the Morrison family scattered. Thomas died in 1952, his wife followed in 1956, and their 3 children all moved away from New York and apparently lost interest in the remote cabin. But there was a notation in the county property records that caught my attention. In 1954, there had been a brief investigation into a possible missing person case connected to the Morrison property. A woman named Eleanor Sutton, age 26, had been employed as a summer caretaker for the cabin in 1953 and 1954. She'd been reported missing by her landlord in Saranac Lake in August of 1954 after failing to pay rent for 2 months. A brief search had been conducted, but with no evidence of foul play and Eleanor having no close family to push for a more thorough investigation, the case had eventually been filed as a voluntary disappearance. Eleanor Sutton was assumed to have simply left the area, and no one had looked for her since. Until now. I shared my findings with Diane and Victor. "I think we know who's in that bundle," I said. "Eleanor Sutton, missing since August 1954. Someone wrapped her body in canvas and dumped her in the lake near the cabin where she worked." "But who?" Diane asked. "The Morrison family. Maybe. Or maybe whoever was responsible came back yesterday, 70 years later, and left those messages in the cabin. Someone who's been carrying this secret for decades and finally couldn't carry it anymore." Victor was less convinced. "That would make the person at least in their 80s or 90s. I don't see someone that age diving down 12 feet to retrieve lake mud." He had a point, but the alternative explanations were even less plausible. Unless, what if it wasn't the original perpetrator? I said slowly, thinking it through. What if it was someone who recently learned about what happened, a child or grandchild who found out about their family's dark secret and decided to expose it? That would fit with the evidence better. Someone young enough to dive and physically capable of carrying out the actions we'd witnessed. but connected to the original crime through family or personal history. Someone who had decided that after 7 decades, Eleanor Sutton deserved to be found and her killer exposed. The medical examiner's preliminary report arrived 2 days later, and it confirmed our suspicions while raising new questions. The remains in the canvas bundle were indeed human, female, and consistent with having been submerged for approximately 70 years. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Eleanor Sutton had been murdered before being wrapped in canvas and dumped in the lake. But there was something else, a detail that made me go back and re-examine everything we'd found. The ME noted that the rope used to tie the canvas bundle was a specific type of braided hemp that had been commonly used in the 1950s, but was rare today. When forensics analyzed the rope, they found something unexpected: traces of fresh organic material mixed with the old fibers. Someone had handled this rope recently, within the past few days, leaving behind skin cells and oil from their hands. DNA analysis would take several weeks, but we now had physical evidence linking someone to the underwater bundle. Whoever had left the messages in the cabin had touched the rope binding Eleanor Sutton's body. They'd gone down to the lake bottom, examined the bundle, and then returned to the cabin with mud to write their cryptic message. The question remained, who? The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days after we recovered Eleanor Sutton's remains, an elderly man walked into the ranger station in Saranac Lake and asked to speak with whoever was investigating the Morrison Place cabin. His name was Richard Morrison, age 87, and he was the youngest son of Thomas Morrison, who'd built the cabin. Richard was frail and moved with the careful slowness of someone whose body had outlived its intended lifespan, but his mind was sharp and his manner direct. He'd driven up from his home in Connecticut as soon as he'd seen news reports about human remains being recovered from Lower Saranac Lake, and he had a story to tell. "I know who killed Eleanor Sutton," he said, without preamble, as he sat in the conference room with Diane, Victor, and myself. "It was my brother James. He confessed to me on his deathbed 5 years ago, and I've been carrying that knowledge ever since." Richard's story was a depressing tale of privilege and violence and decades of cover-up. His brother James, the eldest Morrison son, had been 24 years old in the summer of 1954 when Eleanor Sutton had been working as the cabin's caretaker. James had developed what Richard diplomatically called an inappropriate interest in Eleanor, who had repeatedly rejected his advances. One August morning, James had gone to the cabin while Eleanor was there alone, and when she rejected him again, he'd struck her with a piece of firewood in a rage. "He panicked," Richard said quietly. "He wrapped her body in old canvas from the boathouse, weighted it with rocks, and rowed it out into the lake. He dropped it in the deepest part of the cove and swore he'd never tell anyone what happened." My parents knew something was wrong. James came back to our main house in Albany acting strange, and the cabin was closed up for the rest of that summer. But they didn't ask questions. They didn't want to know, Ishi. "Why didn't you come forward when your brother told you?" I asked. Richard's face sagged with shame. "Because he was dying, and I couldn't stand the thought of his last days being spent in legal proceedings. Because I was a coward. Because I thought maybe if Eleanor had been down there undisturbed for 50 years, maybe she could stay down there and at least James would take his secret to the grave." "But someone else knew," Diane said. "Someone who went to the cabin and left those messages." Richard nodded slowly. "My grandson, David. He's 28, and he'd always been fascinated by the old Morrison cabin. Last month he asked me about its history, and I'm old, and I'm tired of carrying this secret. I told him everything. I thought he'd let it be, but I should have known better. David has always had a strong sense of right and wrong." "Where's David now?" Victor asked. "I don't know," Richard admitted. "He hasn't answered my calls for the past week. After I told him what happened, he became obsessed with the cabin. He talked about diving down to see if the body was still there, about making sure Eleanor Sutton got justice. I tried to talk him out of it, but he went anyway, I finished. He dove down, confirmed the body was there, and left messages in the cabin. But why not just call the police? Why the cryptic mud writing? Richard shook his head. You'd have to ask him. I can tell you that David is a documentary filmmaker. He's always looking for dramatic ways to tell stories. Maybe this was his attempt at, I don't know, creating a narrative? Making sure Eleanor's story couldn't be ignored. We tried to track down David Morrison but had no success. His apartment in Manhattan was empty. His phone went straight to voicemail, and none of his friends had heard from him in over a week. It was as if he'd vanished after leaving his messages in the cabin. Then, a week after Richard Morrison's visit, we got a package at the ranger station. It was addressed to me specifically, and inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. The note read, "Thank you for finding her. I knew if I left the right clues, someone would look. Eleanor Sutton deserved better than to be forgotten at the bottom of a lake." The drive contains everything: my grandfather's confession, historical research, documentation of what I found when I dove down. Use it to make sure people know what happened to her. Use it to make sure she gets justice, even if it's 70 years late. It was signed David Morrison. The USB drive contained exactly what the note promised. Hours of video footage showing David's research process, underwater footage of him diving down to the canvas bundle, and most importantly, a recorded conversation with his grandfather Richard, where the old man detailed everything his brother James had confessed about killing Eleanor Sutton. The case of Eleanor Sutton's murder became something of a media sensation once the story broke. Here was a young woman who'd been killed in 1954, her body hidden for 7 decades, and finally exposed through the determination of a murder victim's killer's grandnephew, who couldn't live with his family's secret. The story had everything: mystery, murder, family guilt, and a young filmmaker who'd taken justice into his own hands by forcing a new investigation through deliberately planted clues. David Morrison eventually surfaced and gave several interviews explaining his actions. He'd spent months planning how to expose his family's secret, ultimately deciding that anonymous tips or direct reporting to police might not be taken seriously enough. Instead, he'd created a mystery that would force investigation, leaving breadcrumbs that would lead rangers or police to the exact spot where Eleanor's body lay. The mud writing, the time notation, the scream Diane had heard, all of it had been carefully orchestrated. David had spent 2 days at the Morrison cabin preparing everything. On the morning of June 7th, at exactly 07:13 a.m., he'd set up a speaker system near the water that played a recorded scream, a sound he'd pulled from a movie soundtrack. He'd known Diane was scheduled to patrol that area based on public ranger schedules, and he'd wanted to establish the time as significant. The next morning, knowing we'd likely investigate any cabins in the area after Diane reported the scream, he'd gone down to retrieve mud from around Eleanor's burial site. He'd used that mud to write his cryptic message, left the time notation, and then disappeared before we arrived. The wet footprints on the dock had been from his diving booties, and he deliberately left the life jacket as another clue that someone had been in the water recently. It was elaborate, perhaps unnecessarily so, but David maintained that he'd wanted to create a narrative that would capture public attention and ensure Eleanor Sutton's case wasn't dismissed as just another cold case. He'd wanted people to care, and in that, he'd succeeded. As for legal consequences, the situation was complicated. James Morrison had died 5 years ago, beyond the reach of justice. Richard Morrison, who'd known about the crime and not reported it, was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony about his brother's confession. David Morrison faced potential charges for filing a false report, the recorded scream, and tampering with the crime scene, disturbing Eleanor's burial site. But prosecutors ultimately decided not to pursue charges given the circumstances and public sympathy for his motivations. Eleanor Sutton herself was finally laid to rest properly. Her remains were claimed by a distant cousin who'd never even known she'd gone missing, and a memorial service was held in Saranac Lake attended by dozens of people who'd never met her but wanted to honor her memory. It was a strange and sad affair, mourning someone who'd been dead for 70 years but had only just been found. I attended the service, standing in the back of the funeral home and thinking about the chain of events that had led us to this point. A young woman had been murdered in 1954. Her killer had kept the secret for 65 years before confessing on his deathbed. That confession had passed to the killer's brother, who'd carried it for 5 more years before telling his grandson, and that grandson had decided the secret had been kept long enough. The Morrison Place cabin was eventually demolished by the state. Too much media attention had made it a target for curiosity seekers and true crime enthusiasts, and the structure was unsafe anyway. The last time I visited the site before demolition, I stood on the dock where we'd first seen those wet footprints and looked out at the water where Eleanor Sutton had lain undiscovered for so long. The lake was calm that day, its surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. It was beautiful and peaceful, giving no hint of the dark history it contained. That's something I've learned over 13 years as a ranger. Wilderness doesn't judge, doesn't moralize, doesn't care about human dramas. It simply exists, containing our secrets and our sins without comment, returning them to us only when we actively seek them out. What David Morrison did was legally questionable and morally complex, but I understand why he did it. Sometimes the weight of a secret becomes unbearable, and sometimes the only way to find peace is to force the truth into the light regardless of the consequences. Eleanor Sutton had been denied justice in 1954, when her murderer's wealthy family had the means and motivation to cover up his crime. But she couldn't be denied justice forever, not when someone decided that silence was more intolerable than exposure. The mud that David had tracked through the Morrison cabin, mud that had surrounded Eleanor's body for 7 decades, became the medium for finally telling her story. In that sense, the lake itself had participated in the revelation, returning a piece of Eleanor to the world above water, providing the physical evidence that would force investigators to look deeper. I've thought a lot about that mud in the months since the case closed, about how something as simple as dirt and water could carry so much meaning, could be transformed from natural sediment into a deliberate message. David had taken material from Eleanor's watery grave and used it to write words that would lead us back to her. It was grotesque in a way, but also oddly appropriate. The evidence of her death became the evidence that would finally expose it. Diane and I still work together, still patrol the remote areas around the Saranac Lakes, still check abandoned cabins for signs of unauthorized use or environmental hazards. But we approach these inspections differently now, with an awareness that sometimes these old structures contain more than just rotting furniture and water damage. Sometimes they contain secrets, and sometimes those secrets are waiting for someone perceptive enough to notice that the mud on the floor doesn't belong there, that the numbers on the table mean something specific, that the scream echoing across the water was meant to be heard. The life jacket we found in the cabin wasn't David's, as it turned out. It had belonged to Eleanor Sutton, part of the safety equipment she'd kept at the Morrison cabin during her employment there. David had found it in a storage closet and hung it prominently as another clue, another piece of Eleanor's story waiting to be discovered. When I learned that, it hit me harder than I expected. That bright orange life jacket representing a life that could have been saved, should have been saved, but instead was ended by violence and hidden away. I kept thinking about the moment when Diane and I had first entered the cabin and seen the mud on the floor. My immediate reaction had been confusion. Where had it come from? Why was it there? I'd been looking for a logical explanation, some mundane reason why lake bottom sediment would be spread across a wooden floor. It never occurred to me in that first moment that the mud was intentional, that it was a message, that someone had carefully gathered it specifically to tell a story that had been suppressed for 70 years. That's the thing about ranger work that they don't teach you in training. You learn to read landscapes, to interpret signs and tracks and disturbances in the natural environment. But sometimes you encounter signs that aren't natural at all, that are deliberately placed by someone trying to communicate something they can't say directly. Learning to recognize those artificial signs, to understand that they're not mistakes or anomalies but intentional messages, requires a different kind of awareness. The investigation into Eleanor Sutton's murder also revealed other troubling aspects of the Morrison family history. Once reporters started digging into Thomas Morrison's background, they uncovered a pattern of behavior suggesting that covering up James Morrison's crime hadn't been an isolated incident. Thomas had used his wealth and influence to shield his children from consequences multiple times over the years, and there were suggestions that James himself had been involved in other incidents that were quietly settled or ignored. None of this could be proven conclusively. The key players were all dead, and the documentary evidence was thin. But the picture that emerged was of a family that believed its money and status placed it above accountability, and of a young woman like Eleanor Sutton, who'd been vulnerable precisely because she lacked the resources or connections to protect herself. Richard Morrison, to his credit, didn't try to defend his family's actions once the truth came out. In an interview he gave shortly before his death, 6 months after Eleanor's remains were recovered, he spoke openly about the corruption of privilege and the moral failures that had allowed his brother to literally get away with murder. "I've lived 87 years," he said in that interview, "and the worst thing I ever did was stay silent when I should have spoken. My brother killed an innocent woman, and I helped hide that truth. First through ignorance when it happened, and later through cowardice when I learned about it. If there's any lesson to be drawn from this tragedy, it's that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice, no matter how much time passes." David Morrison's documentary about the case, which he completed and released online about a year after Eleanor's body was recovered, focused heavily on this theme of complicity and silence. He'd titled it "The Weight of Water," a reference to how Eleanor's body had been weighted down and hidden beneath the lake, but also to the metaphorical weight of carrying knowledge of her murder. I watched the documentary when it was released, and I have mixed feelings about it. On one hand, David had done important work in exposing a decades-old crime and giving Eleanor Sutton a voice she'd been denied in death. On the other hand, the theatrical way he'd gone about it, the planted clues, the recorded scream, the mud messages, felt manipulative and more about creating compelling content than about genuine justice. But maybe that's too harsh. Maybe in our current media-saturated culture, the only way to make people care about a 70-year-old murder is to present it as a mystery, to create a narrative with dramatic reveals and emotional beats. Maybe David understood something about modern attention spans that I don't, that straightforward reporting of a cold case wouldn't have generated the same level of interest or outrage. The cabin site where the Morrison place once stood is now just an empty clearing near the water's edge. Nature has already started reclaiming it. Saplings have pushed up through where the floor once was, and undergrowth is slowly erasing any evidence that a structure ever existed there. In a few more years, there'll be nothing left to show that this was once a place where summer vacationers came to enjoy the wilderness, or that it was the last place Eleanor Sutton was seen alive. I visit the site occasionally when I'm patrolling that section of the lake. I'm not sure why. It's not like there's anything to see or inspect anymore. But I feel drawn to it somehow, as if standing on that spot keeps some connection alive between what happened there and the present day. The lake doesn't care, of course. The water continues to lap against the shore exactly as it always has, indifferent to human concerns about justice or memory or the weight of secrets. The one physical artifact I kept from the investigation is a photograph of the mud writing on the cabin floor. "She went under," spelled out in crude finger-drawn letters. I keep it in a desk drawer at home, and sometimes I take it out and look at it, thinking about David Morrison kneeling on that dirty floor, carefully forming letters with mud he'd dredged up from around a woman's body, leaving a message he knew someone would eventually find and investigate. It was theatrical, yes, but it was also effective. Without those messages, Eleanor Sutton would still be at the bottom of Lower Saranac Lake, her murder unknown and unjustified. David's elaborate clue-leaving had forced us to look, to dig deeper, to care about the fate of a woman who'd been dead for longer than most of us had been alive. Diane transferred to a different region about a year after the Eleanor Sutton case. She said it wasn't because of the case itself, that she'd just been offered a promotion that required relocation. But I wonder. Some cases get under your skin in ways that make it hard to stay in the place where they occurred. Every time Diane patrolled past the Morrison Place site, she would have been reminded of that morning when we first saw the wet footprints on the dock, when we entered the cabin and found the impossible mud spread across the floor. I still think about that mud more than I probably should. About how something as ordinary as lake-bottom sediment could carry such weight of meaning, could be transformed through human action from a natural phenomenon into a deliberate act of communication. The mud hadn't chosen to be part of David's elaborate revelation, but it had served its purpose perfectly, shocking enough to demand attention, mysterious enough to force investigation. In the end, that's what solved a 70-year-old murder. Mud in a place it shouldn't be, numbers that marked a specific time, and the scream of a woman who'd been silenced decades ago, finally given voice through a speaker system and a recorded sound file. It wasn't traditional detective work, wasn't forensic science or witness testimony or physical evidence in the usual sense. It was theater designed to capture attention and force action. And it worked. The Adirondacks are full of secrets. In my 13 years as a ranger here, I've learned that these mountains and lakes and forests have witnessed countless human dramas, some of which leave traces and some of which vanish without evidence. Eleanor Sutton's murder would have been the latter if not for David Morrison's determination to expose it. How many other Eleanors are out there, buried in remote places, their stories lost because no one alive knows or cares to reveal what happened to them? I don't know the answer to that question, and part of me doesn't want to know. Part of me wants to believe that Eleanor's case was unique, an isolated tragedy rather than representative of a pattern. But the pragmatic part of me, the part that's spent over a decade working in wilderness law enforcement, knows better. These wild places contain our secrets because we believe they'll keep them forever. We throw bodies in lakes and bury evidence in forests and convince ourselves that nature will erase what we've done. And mostly, that belief is correct. Nature is very good at reclaiming what we try to hide, at slowly dissolving evidence until nothing remains but questions. But sometimes nature gives those secrets back. Sometimes a lake level drops and exposes what was once hidden. Sometimes erosion uncovers a shallow grave. Sometimes someone like David Morrison comes along and decides that what nature kept secret should be revealed. The mud in the Morrison cabin was nature's way of participating in that revelation, providing the physical medium for a message that needed to be delivered. In using that mud, David was essentially letting Eleanor Sutton herself point to where she lay, using material from her resting place to guide us back to her. It's been 3 years now since we found Eleanor's body. The Morrison cabin is gone, the legal proceedings are concluded, and David Morrison has moved on to other documentary projects. Life continues around Lower Saranac Lake exactly as it always has, with fishermen and kayakers and summer tourists enjoying the wilderness without any awareness of the dark history, just beneath the surface. But I remember the wet footprints on that gray cedar dock. Remember the smell of the cabin interior, mildew and rot, and that peculiar wet earth odor that had been our first hint that something was wrong. I remember kneeling beside the mud patches, trying to understand where they'd come from and what they meant. I remember the moment when I first read those words finger-drawn on the bedroom floor. She went under. Those 3 words told us everything and nothing. They confirmed that someone had gone into the water, but not who or when or why. They were simultaneously a confession and an accusation, a memorial and a warning. David had chosen them carefully, I'm sure, understanding that their ambiguity would force investigation, while their specificity would point us toward the truth. The number 0713, written on that paper on the table, had served a similar purpose. It was specific enough to seem significant, but ambiguous enough to require interpretation. When Diane had made the connection between that time and when she'd heard the scream, everything else had fallen into place. The mud became not random dirt tracked into an abandoned building, but physical evidence of something hidden beneath the lake. The scream became not a loon call or other wildlife sound, but a deliberate signal meant to mark a specific moment. David Morrison had constructed an elaborate puzzle designed to lead us to Eleanor Sutton, and it had worked exactly as he'd intended. We'd followed his clues, made the connections he'd wanted us to make, and ultimately recovered a body that had been hidden for 7 decades. In that sense, he'd succeeded in his goal of forcing justice for a woman who'd been denied it in life and in death. But I'm still not entirely comfortable with his methods. Using theatrical tricks to manipulate an investigation, leaving false clues that could have diverted resources away from real emergencies, creating what amounted to a scavenger hunt around a woman's murder, it all feels slightly wrong to me, even if the outcome was ultimately positive. Diane had a different perspective when we discussed it before she transferred. Would we have found Eleanor any other way? She asked. If David had just called in an anonymous tip, would we have dragged the lake bottom looking for a 70-year-old body? Be honest. She was right, of course. An anonymous tip about a decades-old possible drowning wouldn't have generated the kind of immediate, intensive response that finding fresh mud and cryptic messages in an abandoned cabin had produced. David had understood that, had known that creating an active mystery would mobilize resources in a way that historical speculation never would. He'd also understood that in our current media environment, a good story gets attention and engagement in ways that dry facts don't. By framing Eleanor's discovery as a mystery to be solved rather than a cold case to be reopened, he'd ensured maximum public interest and pressure for thorough investigation. It was cynical, perhaps, but effective. The legacy of the Eleanor Sutton case extends beyond just her specific situation. In the months following the recovery of her body, multiple other cold cases in the region were reopened and reinvestigated. The publicity surrounding Eleanor's murder had reminded people that the Adirondacks had a history of unsolved disappearances, and there was renewed pressure on law enforcement to revisit some of those cases with fresh eyes and modern forensic techniques. Several of those cases remain unsolved, but at least 2 have been closed with definitive answers about what happened to missing persons from decades ago. In that sense, David Morrison's theatrical revelation of his family's secret had ripple effects that went far beyond just Eleanor Sutton, providing closure to other families who'd been living with uncertainty about the fates of their loved ones. I still patrol the Saranac Lakes several times a week, still check abandoned cabins and remote campsites, still respond to calls about missing hikers or suspicious activity in the wilderness. But now I approach every situation with an awareness that sometimes the physical evidence we find isn't what it appears to be on the surface. Sometimes mud on a floor is just mud tracked in by careless hikers. And sometimes it's a deliberate message left by someone trying to expose a 70-year-old murder. Learning to tell the difference, to recognize when something ordinary is actually extraordinary, to understand when nature is behaving naturally and when human hands have arranged things to appear natural while hiding something darker. That's the real skill of wilderness law enforcement. It's not something they teach in training academies, and it's not something you can learn from textbooks. It comes only from experience, from years of seeing what people do in wild places when they think no one is watching. The Morrison place is gone now, returned to forest. Eleanor Sutton rests in a proper cemetery with a headstone bearing her name. David Morrison has moved on to other projects, and I continue my work in the Adirondacks, carrying with me the knowledge that these beautiful wild places contain secrets, and that sometimes those secrets are meant to be found. The dried mud in the lake cabin was one of those secrets, waiting for someone perceptive enough to recognize it for what it was. Not an accident or an anomaly, but a message. A message that said, look deeper, dig further, don't accept the surface explanation. A message that said, someone was here, something happened, and the truth is still waiting to be uncovered. And in the end, we did uncover it. Eleanor Sutton's truth, hidden beneath 12 feet of lake water for 70 years, finally came to light because someone cared enough to force the issue, to refuse to let an old injustice remain buried. That's what I think about when I'm out on patrol, when I'm checking remote cabins and following unclear trails. I think about Eleanor and about David, and about the weight of secrets carried across generations. I think about how wilderness can keep our secrets or reveal them depending on how hard someone is willing to look. And I think about mud, ordinary, unremarkable lake-bottom mud, transformed through human intention into something that speaks, that tells stories, that demands justice for the dead. The water remembers. The mud remembers. And now, finally, so do we.